Historians have read it. What's a devastating event that no one talks about? Galveston, Texas was once considered to be one of the most important commercial ports in the United States, and was referred to by several fantastical names such as the Queen City of the Gulf and the Wall Street of the West. All that changed when it suffered a near-direct hit from a devastating Category 4 hurricane in 1900. The deadliest natural disaster in American history. Pretty much the entire city was destroyed by a storm surge, and anywhere from 8,000 to 12,000 people died. Galveston was rebuilt, but it never truly regained its status. Houston became the state's commercial center in the storm's wake, in addition to other factors. Story 2. This is fairly recent, started in 1998 and ended in 2003, but the Second Congo War. It's the deadliest conflict since World War II, with about 5.4 million deaths, a vast majority of them due to malnutrition and disease. Edit. Glad to see this post getting so much attention. As some of you mentioned, a lot of African history is overlooked, so here are a few more 20th century African conflicts to look into if you're interested. Boer Wars, Mau Mau Uprising, Rhodesian Bush War, First and Second Liberian Civil War, Sierra Leone Civil War, Angolan Civil War, First and Second Sudanese Civil War, Somali Civil War, Eritrean Ethiopian War, Congo Crisis, Nigerian Civil War. Story 3. Leprosy colonies of Hawaii. People who were diagnosed with leprosy were forcibly banished to Kalaupapa to live out the rest of their lives. They were dug graves, had to stand in them, while their families and friends basically had a living funeral for them where they had the dirt thrown on them. They were then pronounced dead to the world and no longer part of the community. This continued through 1969, even after Hawaii officially became a state. Story 4. During World War II, the Japanese had invaded the Alaskan island of Attu. On the island was the village of Attu, where the Aleutian tribe had lived for centuries. The only non-natives were wife schoolteacher and priest husband, who were elderly and beloved by the townspeople. The husband was shot in front of his wife by the Japanese. After that, the Japanese loaded the native population onto ships back to Japan, where they worked in POW camps, where many died from disease and execution. The Japanese saw them as lower than soldier POW and almost subhuman because they didn't fight back and thus treated them horribly. When the war ended, only a handful of the native population survived, and they went back home only to find their village burned down. They left the island and it now remains uninhabited basically, driving the Attu tribe to extinction. Years later, the Japanese left a peace monument on the island in honor of the American and Japanese soldiers that died there, but have yet to recognize to the descendants of the Attu tribe they destroyed. Story 5. In 535, humans went through hell. Many reported a strange color in the skies. Not just in Europe, a dense, dry fog was also reported in Asia and the Middle East. Even the regions now known as the Americas weren't spared, e.g., drought in Peru. Temperatures were rather low in some places. It snowed either in the summertime. One survivor, a Roman politician named Cassiodorus, explained about the bluish sun and no shadows being cast, even in the noon. It has been hypothesized that Iceland holds the reason for the events between the years 535 and 536. Iceland is known for its volcanoes, and it was possible one such was to blame. So this is a great example of how lack of technological advances, things that can be easily explained away today with science and research, back then they had no idea, so their minds are just running rampant, like the bluish sun and the thick fog. Obviously, all of that can be explained away now by a volcanic eruption, an ash in the air kind of blocking out the sun, making it seem like it's a different color. So it's interesting to see how, like, at different points in history, when those people didn't know obviously what we know now, what they were thinking was possibly happening on the planet. Story 6. One thing that doesn't get talked about was more of a phenomenon or major problem than event, and that was how many people died in theater fires due to poor design, combustible materials, few fire exits, and panic. One of the worst was the Iroquois Theater in Chicago in 1903, which is both the deadliest theater fire and the deadliest single building fire in U.S. history, where patrons died after sparks from an arc light set a curtain on fire. Then a chain reaction started. exacerbated by failures of the things in place that were supposed to combat fire. The theater had been overbooked to compensate for earlier poor sales, causing some to sit blocking the exits. The fire was immediately worsened when performers opened the stage door to get outside as it turned the fire into a fireball. Many people were held inside by iron gates that had been put in place to prevent people from sneaking in without paying. As people fled, they tumbled downstairs, trampled each other, and got squashed to death. Their unfamiliarity with the building got them stuck in dead ends and up against windows. Many jumped from fire escapes and died, while those behind them were saved, the bodies of the earlier jumpers cushioning their falls. All in all, 602 people died. Many were children. The story is a lot more complicated and sordid with city corruption, etc. The one takeaway is the incident promoted the development and use of the panic bar. Ad. Sorry this is so poorly written. I was trying to write it really fast on my phone. Ad. Thanks to everyone who's providing more stories and info for me to look at. I love it. Story 7. Taiping Heavenly Kingdom of Hongxi Quan. Put simply, there's a usurped kingdom in 1850s China that directly and indirectly led to the deaths of millions, maybe 10 million plus, of people through massacre and famine. Hong Quan believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ and persuaded enough people to follow along and start a civil war. Check out God's Chinese Son by Jonathan Spence. Story 8. There's so many that I would go with that will probably be mentioned in other comments, but I think any stories about workers in the early 1900s are pretty horrible. Here's a pretty horrible event, for example. After being told that the paint was harmless, the women in each facility ingested deadly amounts of radium after being instructed to point their brushes on their lips in order to give them a fine tip. Some also painted their fingernails, face, and teeth with the glowing substance. The women were instructed to point their brushes in this way because using rags or a water rinse caused them to use more time and material, as the rinse was made from powdered radium, gum arabic, and water. Many women died and became sick with horrendous diseases. One woman named Molly Maggie had her jawbone crumble. By May, her dentist thought Molly needed surgery to remove a fast-growing abscess he'd found on her jaw. When he got the gums open, the bone didn't look right as it was too ashy and gray, and he gently prodded it with his finger. To his shock and horror, the whole bone crumbled under his fingertip like ashes in a fireplace. Instead of removing a tumor, he wound up digging Molly's entire left jaw out with nothing but his fingers. Unbeknownst to him, the radium had perforated the bone cells and stripped them of calcium. It had, like a little machine gun, shredded the collagen inside the bone and left it as little more than a pile of splinters. There's also a great book on this called The Radium Girls, The Dark Story of American Shining Women by Kate Moore. This whole story is extremely depressing. Work in the 1800s and early 1900s was pretty horrible for a lot of women, men, and children. Brew wenches, female miners in the 19th century. You can look that up. Children in chimney sweeps, etc. Story 9. I talked about this on a similar prompt a month or so ago, but I think people should know about this event, so I'm copying and pasting it again here. The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of March 8, 1937, a school teacher at the school in New London, Texas, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family. So I really didn't know too much about it, other than the fact that he'd survived, until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated. So my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his actually very interesting life, including a big section on the New London school explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial beneficial for everyone else. He was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies and parts of bodies everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and other classmates jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boy started lowering the badly injured to them. Then, those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to this story about the day and the aftermath. Most of it is absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits, though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. My grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including Peleliu and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Okay, so this one definitely shook quite a bit. Anytime you have a mass tragedy involving children, it's absolutely heart-wrenching. But to think that OP here had 2 family members survive that explosion strictly because they were misbehaving, I can't even imagine the survivor's guilt, especially the grandfather who only survived because he had to switch seats with another girl, and that girl obviously got blown away during the explosion, sitting in his old seat. So that's horrible. That's the first that I've honestly ever heard of it. Definitely going to look that one up. But that's, man, oh man. Thank you for sharing that, OP. I know that probably wasn't easy, but definitely something that more people need to know about. Story 10, the Carrington event. In 1859, solar flares hit the Earth, causing an aurora borealis effect to be seen all over the world. It lasted for several days, during which time it was reportedly bright enough to be read by at midnight. Telegraph operators reported receiving shocks and burns from the devices, and in some cases removed the batteries powering the telegraphs, as signals were being disrupted by the geomagnetic storm. After removing the batteries, the telegraphs still operated, in some cases better than they had when powered. It wasn't particularly devastating at the time, but it's estimated that if a similar storm were to hit us today, it would cripple the entire planet for potentially decades. The estimated repair cost in the US alone is measured in the trillions. In 2012, a similar storm missed the Earth by 9 days. Story 11. I'm not really a proper historian, but I feel the need to mention the Bronze Age collapse. It's not as though nobody talks about it at all, but considering how catastrophic it was, it doesn't get nearly enough attention. At this time, civilizations were still pretty scarce, but the Eastern Mediterranean was full of them. We can't pinpoint an exact reason, but at some point it all fell apart. The Mycenaeans? Gone. The Hittites? Gone. The Minoans? Gone. The Egyptians? Barely clinging on and having serious problems. There are many things that happened around that time in that general area that could be the culprit. Volcanoes, earthquakes, drought, famine, war, and invasions from foreigners that came by boat that historians have named the Sea People because we have basically no idea where they came from. In reality, it was probably a combination of some or even all of them. Again, I'm not a proper historian by any means, but this is what I heard. Actual historians, feel free to correct any mistakes or mention something I missed. Story 12. The Highland Clearances. Over a period of about 150 years between the 18th and 19th centuries, England and lowland Scottish lords evicted thousands upon thousands of Highland Scots from their ancestral homelands and replaced them with sheep. It's hard to classify as a historical event because it went on for so long and is usually interpreted as an ambiguous series of largely isolated incidents. There were attacks on villages in which the landlords would burn their tenants' houses to the ground to get them to leave and burn their land so that nothing could grow. Multiple people were caught in the fires and died. During the Glencoe massacre, 30 members of Clan MacDonald were murdered by Scottish government forces for supporting the Jacobite uprising. The Irish potato famine also affected the Highland Scots who grew potatoes, and many people starved or were forced to leave as well. As a result, there was a series of mass migration in which Scots traveled to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, and largely lost their language and culture. It's very sad, and all that is basically why Highland culture and language has largely been lost. Story 13. The disease outbreaks that hit the Americas with the arrival of the Europeans. You hear about a 90% death rate and it sounds made up, but whatever the actual number was, entire civilizations were literally wiped out. Cultures that had existed for thousands of years are just gone, with barely a record left. You have stories of people coming across whole villages of corpses. These people died never even having seen the Europeans, never knowing what was killing them and their loved ones, and totally helpless to do anything about it. Story 14. Something that is well known, but not by that much, is the Goiânia incident in Brazil, where cesium-137 was handled by many people, including children. It's regarded as the worst radioactive incident to happen in Brazil. It was a radioactive contamination incident that happened on September 13, 1987, after a radiotherapy machine from an abandoned hospital was illegally stripped for parts, and said parts were stolen. On September 16th, one of the thieves opened a cesium capsule and then on September 18th sold it to a scrapyard. At that same night, the owner of the scrapyard saw a blue glow in the machine's parts, which was the cesium capsule that had been opened. Thinking it might be valuable, he brought it to his home. Over the next 3 days, he invited friends and family to see the strange glowing substance. On September 21st, one of his friends succeeded in freeing several rice-sized grains of the glowing material from the opened capsule. He then started sharing some of them with friends and family. On September 25th, the capsule was again sold to another scrapyard, although 1 day before the sale, more dust was removed from the capsule by the scrapyard owner's brother. The brother then took the dust home and spread it on the concrete floor, where later his daughter would play in and with the dust. She also ate while sitting on the floor, and dust particles fell on her food, contaminating it. One of the family members of the owner of the first scrapyard noticed that many people around her fell ill, and on September 28th, she reclaimed the capsule from the second scrapyard and brought it to a hospital. In the morning of September 29th, it was confirmed that the material was radioactive, and the doctors persuaded authorities to take immediate action on the matter. The city, state, and national governments were all aware of the incident by the end of the day. News of the radiation incident was broadcast on local, national, and international media. Within days, nearly 130,000 people went to local hospitals, concerned they might have been exposed. Of those, only 250 were indeed contaminated, some with radioactive residue still on their skin. 4 of those people died, including a 6-year-old girl. The one that ate food had been contaminated by dust particles. Edit. For those who are making fun of the child's death or calling these people ignorant/stupid, 1. The child wasn't fed the dust. particles contaminated her food. 2. The dust looked like glitter. That's the reason people thought it was harmless and handed it to friends and family. Highly recommend the 1990 movie Sessio 137, The Nightmare of Goiânia by Roberto Pires, so you can get a better understanding of what happened. 3. Those people were in their majority poor and probably didn't have access to almost, if any, education. In the 70s to 80s, having completed high school was uncommon for people from poor origins, and even if they did, the public education from Brazil wasn't that great, and probably didn't even know radiation poisoning was a thing. 4. Have some little respect for the child. She died alone in the hospital because staff were so afraid of going into her room and getting contaminated. She also had to be buried in a closed lead casket, and there were protesters asking for her not to be buried in a public graveyard. Imagine being the parent of the child and realizing you did this because you didn't even know that radiation was a thing that existed. Have some compassion and respect for these families. Story 15. Asked my history studying friend about this. She said there's a lot of events that people don't talk about. For example, there was a lot of countries involved in the Balkan conflict who knew about the massacre of Srebrenica but still allowed it to happen. So many historical events are just so grim and depressing when you read about it. We knew bad things were happening but didn't stop until it was too late for many people. Story 16. The Milan Conference. Back in 1880, a bunch of educators of the deaf all decided to meet in Milan to determine how best to teach deaf people. 164 delegates were in attendance, only one of whom was deaf. At the time, there was a conflict among educators of deaf people about whether an oralism or manualism-based approach was better. Proponents of oralism argued that deaf people would never succeed in society if they could not speak and hold a conversation in the same way a hearing person would. To this end, anyone who attempted to sign would be punished, and deaf people were forced to lip read. At the end of the conference, sign language was banned in all educational institutions, and deaf people were not allowed to teach, for fear that it would encourage the use of sign language. As a result, for roughly 100 years, deaf people were essentially isolated from communication and unable to form communities. To this day, amongst older generations of deaf people, many still have never learned to sign. In addition, deaf culture as a whole was and is profoundly affected by this event, because it essentially stole stories that had been passed down from generation to generation, erasing the history of deaf people and the deaf community. Story 17. The sinking of the MV Willem Gustloff in 1945 was the most deadly civilian shipwreck in history. It was a German army ship mostly carrying Polish, Lithuanian, and Estonian World War II refugees. It was torpedoed by a Soviet submarine. At least 9,400 people died. Some estimates go up to 11,000. It's absolutely criminal that the Titanic gets so much more attention, although it was awful, obviously, when the Gustloff sinking killed nearly 10 times as many people. There's a spectacular historical fiction novel about it by Rita Septis called Salt to the Sea. Highly recommend. It's very humanizing. Edit. I mistakenly called it a passenger ship. It was an army ship. Sorry, guys. It was also a part of Operation Hannibal, the least successful part of it, actually. And because of this, there were a number of Nazi soldiers on board, most of whom also died, the non-civilian casualties. Story 18. We talk a lot about Columbine and Sandy Hook, but few people nowadays remember the 1927 bombing of the school in Bath, Michigan, or the explosion of a school in New London, Texas in 1937, that in addition to killing almost 300 people, launched the career of a cub reporter named Walter Cronkite. The Bath Massacre was mostly done with dynamite, wired into the school by a disgruntled janitor who also killed his wife and some of his livestock, and the New London disaster is why natural gas, which is odorless, has an unpleasant-smelling gas added to it. Some people who went to parts of the school in the days preceding the blast complained of headaches and dizziness, but nobody could figure out why. Story 19. The Sand Creek Massacre. U.S. troops slaughtered an unprotected village, which was flying the white flag of surrender at the time and full of women and children, murdering at least 150, possibly more of them, almost unspeakably brutally. The victims were Southern Cheyenne, who had already ceded their territory in compliance with the U.S. government and had relocated to Sand Creek under U.S. military orders. At the time of the attack, the encampment was flying both the American flag and the white flag of surrender. I'll let Wikipedia take it from here. I saw the bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces, worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. The women cut all to pieces, with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out. Children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from sucking infants up to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. John S. Smith. Congressional testimony of Mr. John S. Smith in 1865. I saw one squaw lying on the bank, whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child lying by her side. Robert Bent, New York Tribune, 1879. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead, and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards and draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bee. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down, and fired at the little child. But he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark and fired, and the little fellow dropped. Major Anthony, New York Tribune, 1879. Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of White Antelope, lying solitarily in the creek bed, was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and testicles, the last for a tobacco pouch. Stan Hoig. After the smoke cleared, Shivington's men came back and killed many of the wounded. They also scalped many of the dead, regardless of whether they were women, children, or infants. Chivington and his men dressed their weapons, hats, and gear with scalps and other body parts, including human fetuses and male and female genitalia. They also publicly displayed these battle trophies in Denver's Apollo Theater and area saloons. I saw another source once mentioning baby shoes from the massacre, with tiny feet still inside them, being sold by the soldiers as souvenirs. Story 20. Company towns. Especially since some states are attempting to bring them back, it's important to understand how effing horrible life was in them. Edit. For those wanting elaboration, a company town is essentially a town in which a single company is the governing body. That company makes the laws, establishes taxes, has a police force, and the people living there are forced into a lifetime of hard labor, where they are paid in scrip. They have to also pay rent to the company, so that's where their wages go, and they're thrusted so deep into debt that they can never leave. Story 21. Obligatory, not a historian, but I'm in college studying history. The year of living dangerously in Indonesia in 1965 to 66 saw absolute chaos and still has a marked effect on their society. It's possibly one of the largest mass killings in the last century, and I had heard nothing about it ever living in the West. It's hard to say how many people actually died, but estimates range from 100K to 300K, and even on up to 500K or a million dead. Basically, the Communist Party in Indonesia was heavily influenced by Maoism and ethnic Chinese civilians. It was the largest communist party outside of China. President Sukarno, who had helped the country through Japanese occupation and independence from the Dutch/British, had kept the house of cards balanced, but was beginning to be swayed by communist policies. The military, staunchly anti-communist and largely supported by the U.S., would be looking to take power. One night, 6 high-ranking members of the military were abducted and killed. The army spread the word that the communists were to blame and initiated mass reprisals. Killings, torture, and imprisonment ran rampant over the islands, and even ethnic Chinese or just suspected communists were taken. Despite working with Sukarno for many years, the U.S. would support his liquidation and the rise of the military. It's unclear how extensive American support of the army was, but it's probable they aided in training and may have even helped compile names of communists to the army. Eventually, a general by the name of Suharto would take power, and Sukarno would be placed under house arrest with no power. Today, the massacres and chaos are not really taught in Indonesian schools, and it's clear that many have not come to terms with what happened. However, the mass killings of possibly 1 million or more people should rank up there in devastating events. Story 22. For me, Black Wall Street in the United States and residential schools in Canada. I didn't learn about either of them while studying history in university. I found out about Black Wall Street here on Reddit and did the research into it so that I could teach my students about it. Disgusting that an entire community was burned to the ground and people were killed based on the accusation of wrongdoing, not on any actual wrongdoing. Residential schools I learned mostly from a colleague. Members of her family went through the residential schools and came back damaged. The government of Canada owes the Indigenous people a huge apology. They have apologized, but has anything improved? And the church system really needs to make amends, and I don't believe they have. Story 23. My go-to answer is the burning of great libraries of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258. The Muslim empires were responsible for saving the texts of Rome and Greece by translating them into Arabic. They had made discoveries into math and science, and they had writings by great philosophers, and all those writings were saved in these great libraries. When the Mongols invaded and sacked Baghdad, they burned and destroyed many great libraries. So much, in fact, that the Euphrates River turned dark blue with the ink of the books. No one knows just how much knowledge we lost, but it is hypothesized that as much as 98% of the texts in these great libraries were destroyed. Considering just how much knowledge we still have, thinking about how all of it is only 2% is insane. We will never truly know how much we lost. Story 24. The Port Arthur Massacre in Tasmania, the worst massacre in Australia's history that was the catalyst for gun reform in the country, happened in 1996 when a lone crazed gunman shot 35 people dead and wounded 23 others. The perpetrator, who shall remain unnamed, was said to have an IQ of 66 and the mentality of an 11-year-old at the time he committed the crimes as an adult. He often told family members and neighbors he was going to do something that would make everyone remember him and that he wanted to shoot a bunch of people. This isn't about remembering him, it's about remembering his victims. Story 25. The genocide of the Romani and Sinti people during the Shoah. Both Jews and Romani were uniquely targeted for the final solution, but there's a distinct ignoring of Roma experience during this period by non-Romani historians and the general public due to anti-Romani racism and the cultural traditions of Romani themselves that are very reluctant to share their story with the non-Roma, which is understandable given everything. I'm a Jewish historian who used to work at a Holocaust museum, so this always bothered me. How much Romani are neglected in the current narrative of the Shoah. Story 26. Vietnamese boat people. Absolutely crazy and literally can't believe this happened, and nobody effing ever talks about it. Think about this. It's the Vietnam War, and you're the Vietnamese and obviously want nothing to do with it. Many saw their only way out was by sea, due to tensions with neighboring countries. So hordes of people tried to escape the country in little boats. Now, here's the kicker. It's estimated that up to 400,000 of them drowned. Most of the women got SA'd by pirates as well. Everything got stolen. People got sick and starved. Pirates kidnapped people. Absolutely horrible. That wiki page makes me feel bad for ever having complained about anything. Story 27. Alright, I got a few. Everyone talks about the evils of the European colonial powers perpetuated on the Chinese people, starting with the Opium Wars and the unequal treaties period, which kicked off China's century of humiliation, the fall of the Qing Empire, and their civil wars, occupation by Japan, rise of the CCP, and so on. Nobody ever talks about how cartoonishly evil and corrupt the Qing Empire was, though. It wasn't a coincidence that European powers with less than 1/10 China's population and resources were able to humiliate one of the largest, by population and GDP, empires the world had ever known to that point. The Qing Empire was just an awful, awful regime, and their various atrocities and crimes against humanity and horrific corruption and oppression are just never mentioned. As an official, he's remembered as the most corrupt official in Chinese history, acquiring himself over his career property worth 1,100 million taels of silver, equal to roughly $270 billion USD. Once secure of the Qianlong Emperor's favor and approbation, Hixin enjoyed almost complete freedom of action. He became openly corrupt and practiced extortion on a grand scale. His supporters within the imperial system followed his lead, and his military associates prolonged campaigns in order to continue the benefits of additional funds. He abrogated powers and official posts, including that of Grand Counselor, and regularly stole public funds and tax revenue. Taxes were raised again and again, and this led to the suffering of the people. Unfortunately, their suffering was compounded by severe floods of the Yellow River, an indirect result of the corruption where dishonest officials pocketed funds that were meant for the upkeep of canals and dams. Rising prices of rice led to many that simply starved to death. This widespread corruption and nepotism was the start of a century that led to the downfall of the Qing dynasty. Hessian is a bit of a controversial figure in that it's possible he was framed/railroaded by the incoming emperor, but whatever the truth of his personal biography, he's the most famous symbol of one of the most corrupt regimes in history. Anywhere from 30 up to 70 million casualties, all within China, in which a nationalist/religious uprising against Qing corruption and weakness devolved into a total war in which both sides carried out genocidal massacres against whole towns they captured from the other side. The casualties of the far more famous Opium Wars, which were just ending when this rebellion was getting started, were in the thousands to tens of thousands by comparison. Here's a well-known incident. French and British troops at the end of the Opium Wars burned down the Imperial Summer Palace, a senseless destruction and looting of a priceless piece of world heritage. What's rarely mentioned is what prompted them to do so. In 1860, during the Second Opium War, as the Anglo-French expedition force steadily approached Beijing, two British envoys, a journalist for the Times and a small escort of British and Indian troopers, were sent to meet Prince Yi under a flag of truce to negotiate a Qing surrender. Meanwhile, the French and British troops reached the palace. As news emerged that the negotiation delegation had been imprisoned and tortured, resulting in 20 deaths, the British High Commissioner to China, James Bruce, 8th Earl of Elgin, retaliated by ordering the complete destruction of the palace, which was then carried out by British troops. Unable to suffer the indignity of acknowledging a second defeat to foreign powers, the Qing tortured to death 20 people under a flag of truce sent to negotiate the terms of their surrender. Of course, torturing people to death because of feeling insulted is a pretty common feature of human history, and it's certainly not as though England and France were the good guys there, economically and then militarily subjugating people in their own homeland. But in the spirit of the thread, it certainly seems to me that the horrific atrocities and fantastic corruption of the Qing Empire is something nobody ever talks about. Story 28. The paddle streamer P.S. General Slocum that caught fire and sank in the East River in 1904. More than 1,000 German Americans died in the accident, and it was considered the NYC's biggest disaster until 9/11. Up until that point, the city had had a thriving German community, but that single event almost completely destroyed an entire Lutheran church congregation, compromised of many of the city's most influential citizens. Maybe not an event no one talks about, as it's been lamented many times, but certainly a tragic date of historic note. Story 29. Guangxi Massacre during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I'll just quote Wikipedia. In 1968, 38 people in Wushan County were eaten, and 113 officials of the county participated in eating human flesh, hearts, and livers. Chen Guorong, a peasant from Guigang County who happened to pass by Wushuan, was caught and killed by local militia because he was fat. His heart and liver were taken out while his flesh was distributed to 20 people. A female militia leader ate 6 human livers in total and cut the genitals of 5 men and soaked them in alcohol, which she would drink later, claiming that these organs were beneficial to her health. The behavior of eating human flesh, hearts, and livers occurred in many counties of Guangxi, including Wushuan, Wuming, Shaanxi, Guingang, Xinzhou, Guipig, and Lingyun. After the Committee of Revolution was established in Shaanxi County, a killing conference was held in Pingshan Square on September 1st, 1968, during which more than 10 officials and civilians were beaten to death. After the conference, a committee member, Li Hao, removed the hearts and livers from the corpses, sautéing them and preparing them as dishes for other representatives who attended the conference. And like everything involving 20th century China, it gets even worse. Independent researchers in Guangxi counted a total of 421 people who were eaten in a single county, but there were reports of cannibalism across 27 counties in Guangxi. That's 2/3 of all the counties in Guangxi. There was one man who said this to be the so-called fifth category, who was beaten to death where he stood. He had 2 kids, one of 11 and one of 14. The local officials and armed militia said that it was important to eradicate such people so that they not only killed those 2 children, they ate them too. This took place in Pubei County, Guangxi, where 35 people were killed and eaten in total. Most of them were rich landowners and their families. There was one landowner called Lu Jinghuan, whose entire family was wiped out. He had a 17-year-old daughter, Lu Shuhuan, who was gang SA'd by 9 people for 19 times, who then ripped open her belly and ate her liver and breasts. There were so many incidents like this. So clearly grotesque and clearly needs a little bit more PR, but I also, to our audience, I want to apologize for absolutely butchering the pronunciation of those Chinese names. Not to knock down the fourth wall here, but I think my scriptwriter kind of hates me and wants to hear me struggle to pronounce these dozens of Chinese cities and names. And so I hope you guys got a good laugh at my pathetic attempt to say all this crap. Story 30. The essay of Nanking, or Nanjing, easily tops any event I can think of. I don't like playing the Sadness Olympics, but this event is still not well known, really. I go into this saying that studying it in a detailed manner is a traumatic event to read about. Iris Chang's book basically will tell you everything you need to know. But with that said, there are certain things, certain images that you can never get out of your head, and they stick with you. I can't imagine the horror that must have been 1937 China. I won't go into too many graphic details, but it's easily the most horrific event that always pops up. A thing that also really makes it intense is how well documented and photographed it is. There are so many awful, awful photos of it, but it's important to preserve them for the historical record. Story 31. The atrocities committed by Unit 731 during World War II, which involved the torture and deaths of about 500,000 people. Some of the most disgusting things done by the Japanese to their prisoners include, but not even close to limited to, vivisection, injection with diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea, gassing a mother and child together and watching how they behaved as they died, tying humans to stakes and testing grenades, flamethrowers, bayonets, etc. on them, and spearing babies with bayonets. The worst part is, a lot of people involved were granted immunity by the US in exchange for the results of their experiments, and Japanese government officials will pay respects to some of them and other war criminals to this day. Story 32. Mongolian sacking of Baghdad in the late Middle Ages. It effectively ended the Islamic Golden Age, and the city never really recovered. Baghdad was, in some ways, the center of the world at the time. It would be like London being completely and utterly destroyed today. Edit. Just wanted to point out, after reading a bunch of other comments, that there are a ton of major events in history that we don't hear a lot about, specifically because we're in Western civilization and there's a huge bias there. Middle Eastern and Eastern history is equally as fascinating as anything that's happened anywhere else. Story 33. Kluck's turn. During World War I, Alexander von Kluck commanded the right flank of the German line. While 13 miles north of Paris, he wheels his forces east of Paris and exposed his flank to the French forces. This halted the German advance, and soon both sides started digging trenches. There's a good chance if he doesn't do this, the Germans defeat the French early, and we never get the horrific warfare of World War I, and we certainly don't get the rise of Hitler. However, nobody knows what kind of French Hitler would come out of this. One of the biggest what-ifs in history. Story 34. I'm a historian who focuses on disability in 19th century North America, and we have not been awesome in our treatment of people with disabilities historically. I've written papers about sexual and physical abuse in schools for the deaf, and part of that abuse arises from parents of deaf children not knowing ASL well enough for the children to tell them what was happening to them at the school. Vaccines were tested on children labeled mentally defective. 19th century asylums completely relied on patient labor in order to function, so there are cases of people literally being unable to leave because the institution relied so heavily on their work to be productive. You can read more about this in the book Remembrances of Patients Past by Jeffrey Raume. Douglas Bainton once wrote that disability is everywhere in history, once you begin looking for it, but notably absent from our historiography. Disabled people are just invisible to the average historian. While this is getting better, it's still a struggle. This means a lot of things that, to us in the field are common knowledge, are just not well known outside of it. Freak shows forcing people to display their disabilities for money. So-called ugly laws that prevented, quote, unsightly beggars from being on city streets. Susan Schweik has a book about this called The Ugly Laws, Disability in Public. A more correct term would be unsightly beggar ordinances. Disabled girls becoming pregnant while in asylums or institutions because they were SA'd or abused by the staff. Just the horror shows that were asylums and institutions in the early 20th century. They started out in North America with the best of intentions, but devolved fairly quickly. You can read about this in Broken Institutions, Families, and the Construction of Intellectual Disability by Madeline C. Burkhardt. Both the United States and Canada barred people with disabilities from immigrating because they were seen as inherently a burden on the economy. This law didn't change in Canada until 2018. You can read more about the history of politicians in Canada fearing disability in Not Good Enough for Canada, Canadian Public Disclosure around issues of inadmissibility for potential immigrants with diseases and or disabilities, 1902 to 2002, by Valentina Kapuri. I've not read this book, but have read the dissertation it's based on. Or in the U.S. through Bainton's Defectives in the Land, a book I believe every historian of American history broadly or immigration history more specifically should read. So much of what people know about disability and history is Helen Keller, who's often the punchline to a joke rather than a person, Terry Fox and Rick Hansen in Canada, and of course Stephen Hawking. Of course, the history of disability is not just tragedy, 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 hero, tragedy, tragedy now, but the lack of knowledge about the experiences of people with disabilities is a serious absence in our historical knowledge. I like to tell my students about that time the Montreal Metro was invaded by Americans who threw their wheelchairs down the steps and crawled down after them to show how inaccessible the Metro is in their 80s or 90s. It was a major protest. No one knows about it. At the current rate of upgrades, the Montreal Metro will be wheelchair accessible in 2038. That probably doesn't seem like a devastating event, but I think the ongoing neglect of people with disabilities in this country is, and some of that neglect is assuming there's no history there to even discover. Story 35, September 26, 1983. Just after midnight, the Soviet satellite warning system detected one missile, followed by 4 others, headed from the U.S. towards the Soviet Union. Stanislav Petrov was the man in charge of deciding whether or not to launch a counterattack against the United States. He correctly determined that the nuclear warning was a false alarm, and no nukes were launched that day. For a brief moment, he was the most powerful human in existence. A lot more people remember October 27, 1962, as the day the world almost ended, and Vasily Arkhipov is the man who determined the fate of the future of civilization. But the date I mentioned above is more important because the amount of nuclear warheads that existed in the world were far more numerous. Both of those dates were days the world almost ended, and it's up to you to decide which day was more important. I have to give credit to Imp Lemon and Real Life Lore, who covered these topics more in depth. Story 36. Hospital Colonia de Barbacana, aka Museum of Madness. From Wiki, at least 16 people perished every day due to sickness, malnutrition, heart shock due to exposure to low temperatures, and Scottish showers, electroconvulsive therapy, or murder. The staff benefited from remains of the dead patients, as they were often smuggled to universities across the country. Whenever the demand was low, corpses were simply dissolved in acid or buried in nearby grounds. Over 70% of the patients were never diagnosed with any sort of psychological disorder. They were placed under permanent care by political interests and social stigma. These patients were often alcoholics, epileptics, prostitutes, homosexuals, unwanted children, homeless people, women whose virginity was lost before marriage, enemies of the local elite, or simply considered inadequate according to the social norms of the past century. Story 37. 2 interrelated ones. 1. The Holodomor, the terror famine, literally the killing by starvation, in 1932 to 1933. Stalin shut off Ukraine's borders and effectively took all of the country's food as Russia was suffering a natural famine, with the result that millions of Ukrainians died of starvation. Many were forced to draw lots to kill and eat each other to survive. The Holodomor was only formally recognized in Ukraine as having happened in 2006. Prior to this point, Russian propaganda had effaced it from history. But even now, many in the West deny that it happened, if they even knew about it. If you go to Ukraine now, though, many people feel a deep sadness and anger about the Holodomor and the general cover-up, as indeed they do about Chernobyl. 2. The ongoing war in the east of Ukraine between pro-Russia/openly Russian and pro-Ukraine soldiers. Thousands are still dying, even in the midst of the COVID pandemic, over territorial claims. Not looking for a political debate over who's right or wrong, or to bash either side, but it's a needless conflict often forgotten in the news. Story 38. The English rule over Ireland. I guess it's not an event so much as a period, but still. Many died directly and indirectly, e.g. famines. Yes, famines, plural. There were more than the big one. Irish culture, language, and many customs were made illegal, were supposed to be the point of near extinction. Land was stolen and given to English settlers. There was religious persecution, which would create a divide still present today. Little to no political autonomy. Reprisals against civilians for any resistance. Many think of Ireland simply as a green island with a bunch of gingers who drink a lot, but its history is written in the blood of millions. Story 39. The essay of German and other European women by Allied forces during the occupation of Nazi Germany. As the Wehrmacht was beaten back and Allied forces moved in, essays were performed en masse, mostly by the Red Army, but some by the Western forces as well. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of essays occurred, many of them gang essays, with some women going through the experience dozens of times. They were performed on young girls as well as much older women, and the number of deaths due to complications from the essay, abortions, or pregnancies is numbered in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. Apparently, even rear Soviet units essayed women that were liberated from some of the concentration camps. I don't think I've ever typed the word essay so much, and I kind of feel grossed out by it. Story 40. What happened was that there were trials that were about to get underway, similar to those in Nuremberg in Germany in 1945/46. A whole bunch of generals and politicians were being put on trial, which was interrupted by North Korea invading South Korea in 1950, and thus few, if any of them, were actually sentenced. Japan was hugely strategic in the UN/American fight against the communists, and so the government took advantage of this to essentially rewrite history and place Japan as the victim of Western powers in the lead up to World War II. It's why Japan has never been able to fully accept not only the role it's playing in unleashing the war in the first place, but the crimes that it committed against a lot of different people groups. The usefulness of Japan's position close to the Korean Peninsula pretty much negated any effects of the trials and allowed the politicians that weren't charged to slip back into politics with the conservative governments that dominated Japan post-war. Story 41. Janusz Korczak was a Polish educator and children's author who operated an orphanage during the Nazi occupation in Poland. Many times he was offered sanctuary by the Nazis, but refused because he did not want to leave his children. He was very well loved by all the children, and they gave him nicknames like Old Doctor or Mr. Doctor. When the Nazis rounded them up to transport them to Treblinka, he was offered one last time sanctuary, but again refused to leave his children. The children were all dressed modestly and in clean clothing. There is also the statue of Janusz Korczak in Yad Vashem that symbolizes him protecting his children. Not many historical facts bring me to tears, but this one definitely did. Edit. Corrections on my comment. It was not the Nazis, but the Polish resistance that offered him sanctuary, and I should also point out that Janusz Korczak was a Jewish man, so the Nazis were very much okay with him being murdered. Story 42. The only successful coup attempt in American history. In 1898, the coastal city of Wilmington, North Carolina, was home to a significant black no population that had elected popular black leaders into city and state government. In that year, a group of angry white Wilmington residents brutally murdered much of the black government and forced much of the city's black population to leave and head west to cities like Durham, Raleigh, Greensboro, and Charlotte. Many of the organizers of the coup replaced the former black office holders and even went on to govern the state for nearly a generation, including 4 of North Carolina's governors. Most North Carolinians are never told about this in school, and the City Archives of Wilmington keeps most information about this under lock and key after the leaders of the coup tried to suppress the memory of the event decades later, once public opinion began to turn against lynchings and violence. Story 43. Not a historian, but I'm sure the Sun Mai, My Lai, massacre is quite obscure. Hundreds of Vietnamese civilians were killed, mainly women and elderly, by American troops without the victims having any kind of involvement in Viet Cong. On the 16th of March, 1968, William Laws Calley ordered the mass essay and murder of everyone in the small agricultural village. They had to be stopped by chopper pilot Hugh Thompson Jr. The real number of victims is unknown due to the government cover-ups, oscillating between 300 to 500 people. At the end, they only found 3 firearms related to the guerrilla. This was not the only massacre lived in Vietnam through the war, and Calley spent only 3 years in domiciliary arrest and would later be set free by Nixon. Calley was a free man and only apologized in 2009. If this had happened in another regime, the world would have gone quite crazy. Not much was said. Story 44. The destruction of Jerusalem, 70 AD. Let me set the scene. For generations, the Jews have resisted the land of the Romans. Once again, they're in active rebellion. The Romans send their legions with the challenge of conquering the legendary citadel, Jerusalem. Once conquered by King David, Jerusalem became one of the mightiest cities in the world. Pilgrims travel miles for the Passover event every year, and the city's crowning jewel, the temple. At the time, it was one of the biggest buildings in the empire, filled with incense, sacrifices, gold, silver, and jewels beyond count. The city had 10 years' worth of food and water stored. To siege it would be to lose. Yet the Romans sieged it. Eventually, against all predictions at the time, the walls fell. It is a massacre. Soldiers could not be controlled as they were released into the streets, cutting down anyone who stood in their path. Buildings are burned. Blood cast about on the stones like rain from the sky. Eventually, they work their way to the temple. Their orders are to take it intact, but after the devastation caused by the siege, the temple is ransacked, stripped of most of its decorations, then set ablaze. To see that building, to feel what the Jews felt when the house of God was destroyed before them, I wish we could know the fear. For if God's house is not safe, what is? After the blaze recedes to ash, soldiers bring pickaxes to the rubble of the once mighty temple and break the stones in the ground to reach the fold that had melted into the cracks in the floor. At the end of it, nothing remained. This battle left around 1 million Jews and Romans dead. It is a shame it isn't talked about much outside religious circles. The entire history of the Jewish people is really something worth learning about. Thank you for your time. Story 45. Not a historian, but I'm familiar with this as I'm Scottish, but feel like most people outside of Scotland will have never heard of it. The Highland clearances in Scotland had massive populations of Highlanders removed from their land to make way for sheep and farming as landlords saw it had profit. Their homes were burned and they were left to find shelter elsewhere. Many died due to freezing temperatures in the winters and having few belongings. Most that didn't die were forced to leave Scotland, and that's why Scottish populations exist in countries like Canada and Australia. Story 46. The Holodomor. The number of self-described socialists today who don't know about this event boggles the mind. It's literally proof of how socialism, taken to its logical conclusion, is death incarnate. And yet it is not taught in schools, with public knowledge of this event being almost non-existent. The same goes for land reform, the Great Leap Forwards, and so on. Everyone knows about the Holocaust, and rightly so, but we're never told about how communism also killed millions of people. In fact, it probably killed many times more people than Nazism ever did. The only difference between fascist genocides and communist genocides is that communist genocides tended to be more ethnically inclusive, focused as they were on class rather than race. It seems that following World War II, the communists, as well as former Axis powers now working closely with the Allies, such as Japan, were given something of a free pass, at least prior to the Cold War. The communists in particular were always anti-Nazi, so they couldn't be that bad, could they? Yes, they could be that bad. In fact, they were worse. If you bump into anyone today who calls himself a socialist, communist, anarcho-syndicalist, or something similar, assume that they're either naive to the point of genuine retardation, or that they're on the approximate moral level of a neo-Nazi. F communism. Story 47. The genocide of Native Americans is not necessarily a secret, but what a lot of people don't realize is that by the time of the United States Revolutionary War, most of the nations on the East Coast had been gone for some time, and a large amount of the displaced individuals from those nations were living in a collection of refugee camps. These were places where starvation and desperation were an everyday thing. In the winter, many people froze to death. The movement of the inhabitants of these camps was limited by guards. They often weren't allowed to go gather their own food, but they also were not necessarily ever fed. There was basically nothing for the Native Americans to do in these camps but starve. Story 48. The utter destruction that the Roman Empire wrought. Our historiographical approach in the West has often focused on glorifying the Roman Empire as the cultural predecessor of the Western European states, and as such often overlooks the ridiculous amount of damage Rome caused in their bid to control the Mediterranean. The outright genocide of many Celtic, Iberian, and Italic peoples, many of whom were not barbarians but urbanized populations, at least until Rome rolled into town. Gaul suffered the worst of this, and over half of its population would be either killed, enslaved, or migrate away from Caesar's advance. The utter eradication of the Mediterranean substratum also deserves to be mentioned. The many cultures of pre-Indo-European descent that were wiped out or assimilated, their culture forever lost to us, and their languages remain incomprehensible to this day. The Romans were considerably more brutal than any opponent they ever faced, and were unsurprisingly hated by their neighbors even beyond what would be expected for a rising superpower. The stagnation of culture and technology caused by the Roman Empire is also swept under the rug, since Rome was supposed to be so civilized. The collapse of literary and artistic production under the empire was impressive. Innovation basically died, and much work, even of the Golden Latin Age and the Antinous sculptures, were just copies and simulacra of prior Hellenistic work. The scientific impact was also exceptional, as the Greek East was impoverished by Roman rule and lacked the political and social conditions that had allowed it to be such a technological hub during the Hellenistic and Classical Age. The death of Archimedes, the sackings of Athens, the persecutions of philosophers, and burning down the Library of Alexandria. Rome wasn't just marble and cool politics. It was a highly militarized, authoritarian, and conservative society that stifled creativity and technological progress, building an empire through some of the most brutal conquests in history. Story 49. Jasenovac Concentration Camp. Jasenovac was a concentration and extermination camp established in Slovenia by the authorities of the independent state of Croatia, NDH, in occupied Yugoslavia during World War II. The concentration camp, one of the 10 largest in Europe, was established and operated by the governing Utasi regime, which was the only Quisling regime in occupied Europe to operate extermination camps solely on their own for Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies. Also, the only concentration camp for the direct purpose of exterminating Serbian, Jewish, and Gypsy children, one that the Croatians have never accepted or apologized for, nor pay restitution to any survivors. Story 50. Tulsa Race Massacre. May 30th, 1921. Over 1,500 white encountered 75 black men protecting a young black man rumored to have essayed a young white woman. At the end of the conflict, an estimated 300 were dead after rioters rampaged 35 city blocks. Some 1,256 houses were burned. 215 others were looted but not torched. 2 newspapers, a school, a library, a hospital, churches, hotels, stores, and many other black-owned businesses were among the buildings destroyed or damaged by fire. The front page story was removed from the bound archives Tulsa Tribune, and official archives were purged. In the end, it was estimated that the young man bumped into the young lady accidentally. Story 51. Essay of Nanking. We never really talk much about the Japanese in the context of World War II in the West. Europe was never really affected by their activities, and though in the U.S. we were impacted by them, we only discuss them in reference to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But Imperial Japan committed its fair share of war crimes and atrocities. They conducted human experimentation. They had horrible treatment of POWs, and a lot of other issues. Nothing is more emblematic of the sheer sadism of their atrocities than the essay of Nanking. Nanking at the time was the capital of China. The Japanese ended up taking the city, and what they did was terrible. Imagine mass slaughter. Men forced to watch as their daughters, mothers, and wives were forcefully essayed before getting killed themselves. I don't want to get into it too much here because I want people reading this to spend a little bit of time understanding this for themselves. But even the Nazi with the Japanese army at the time named John Rabe, who was super hardcore Nazi in every sense of the word, thought it was so horrific that he established the Nanking safety zone for civilians to escape the brutality, and used his status to delay the Japanese long enough for citizens to escape. Story 52. I wrote a paper once on peaceful revolutions. My professor hated it since he wanted it to be about wars and battles, but I digress. The one revolt that stands out, and I have to mention, is Estonia protesting against their Soviet occupiers by singing their national songs that were banned at the time. I mean, thousands of people gathered at forced assemblies, normally meant as propaganda rallies for the Soviets, and started singing their patriotic songs. It is a really powerful image of unity, and it's captured in an interesting documentary called The Singing Revolution. Rotten Tomatoes even gives it an 83. It happened during our lifetime, but it's forgotten in our collective knowledge. Story 53. At the height of Mayan civilization, it is likely that their library of books would have outnumbered that of ancient Rome, in part due to tree bark conducted to bookmarking that would have been superior to papyrus. An entire library filled with thousands of written records on religion, culture, knowledge, literature, and history. Today, only 4 original books, codices, remain. None currently reside within Mayan territory. Of those 4, only one is truly significant in cultural and religious information, and another has questionable authenticity. To think an entire civilization, culture, and people reduced to a literary narrative of 4 random codices, utter annihilation. I am regrettably by no means very knowledgeable on the depths of Mayan culture and civilization, but understanding this fills me with sorrow trying to come to terms with the magnitude of knowledge and culture lost, and that this devastation is unfortunately only the tip of the iceberg of Native American history. I recommend reading into it. Search Mayan codices and take a look at the Dresden Codex and the Madrid Codex. Both are interesting, and the art within them is truly beautiful. Story 54. The death of 3 million Indians during the Bengal famine of 1943, which was caused by Churchill's policies. He was quoted saying that the cause of the famine was that the Indians were, quote, breeding like rabbits, and asking how, if the shortages were that bad, Mahatma Gandhi was still alive. As an Indian, it is extremely disappointing to watch the whitewashing of Churchill by the West. While it is fair to celebrate him for winning the war, it's extremely unfair to the millions of Indians killed due to his racist colonial policies. Story 55. The era of terrorism in Peru during the 90s. People would get massacred in small towns. People would go without electricity for weeks because terrorists would blow up electric towers. The parliament got raided once by the terrorists and it was televised. My mom always tells us stories of how the building she worked at was exploded by a car bomb and how they were basically in a war zone. That happened 30 years ago. Those are fresh memories. The terrorist group still has some presence, but not as big and threatening as it was in the 80s and 90s. Story 56. I don't know if anyone has said this, but I think that Unit 731 must be mentioned. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese used a facility in Pingfang, China, to conduct some of the most brutal, most inhumane research ever. With the aid of the Japanese government, there were experiments such as dissecting/burning/burying people alive, spinning people to death in giant centrifuges, using people as grenade/flamethrower targets, injecting people with seawater/animal blood, exposing people to severe frostbite, amputating arms/legs, then reattaching them in different places of the body. Most of the victims were Chinese, mentally handicapped individuals, or poor people. Lastly, all the scientists involved in this research were given immunity by the United States in return for the data gathered. Story 57. Not a historian, but honestly as someone who witnessed it and was old enough to remember times before and after the aftermath, the September 11th attacks were absolutely devastating to the United States. It has led to 2 wars that have spanned 2 decades and led to massive shifts in American sentiment. The country as a whole got a lot more fearful and a lot more hostile in general. I wholeheartedly believe that if those attacks were thwarted or never occurred, the current economic and political predicament of the U.S. never happens, and things as a whole are much better for Americans in general. Story 58. The near extinction of humanity. About 100,000 years ago, or so, something terrible happened and we very nearly went extinct. We know this because of a strange pattern in human gene frequencies, which 2 guys figured out likely meant that humans experienced some sort of population crash. Like, is not we were down to around 20,000 people, after which things got better. My claim to fame, I was the 3rd person on Earth to know this. One of the guys who figured this out was my advisor in grad school, and late one night I found him kinda tottering around the halls, headed home. He was so dazed I gave him a lift, and on the way, he explained what he and his old advisor had found. It was so mind-boggling I barely slept that night myself, just staggered by the implications. Listen, I definitely appreciate this story being shared, but it is kind of vague. Need a little bit more information than something terrible happened 100,000 years ago. That could be anything from climate change causing a natural disaster, to disease and famine, to aliens invading the planet and abducting over half of the population. So I don't really know if this is something that you can really plant your flag and say, look, man, I was the 3rd person in the entire world to know that something really bad happened 100,000 years ago. Story 59. The Wangongcheng explosion of 1626. One May morning in Beijing, city residents heard a strange rumbling coming from above, followed by a streak of light. Moments later, there was a blast so massive that it could be clearly heard over 90 miles away, and a mushroom cloud began to rise. The blast was so big that a 2-square-mile section of the city had been completely obliterated. Thousands were killed in the blast, and thousands more were crushed as chunks of destroyed buildings and fragments of shredded bodies rained back down on the rest of the city. By the end of the day, at least 20,000 people died. What was left took years for us to understand. The crater caused by the event was over 20 feet deep and generated enough force to throw a 3-ton statue clear over the city walls. At first, it was believed that the city armory, which was near the center of the blast zone, must have been the source of the explosion, while there were several tons of gunpowder stored there that wouldn't be nearly enough to explain the force of the blast. Today, the prevailing theory is that the devastation was caused by an air-bursting meteor, like the one that caused the much more famous, and far less lethal, Tunguska event. It is, however, possible that the gunpowder in the armory also detonated, adding to the disaster, which would be an almost cosmic stroke of bad luck. Just a fun reminder that a giant space rock could spontaneously level an entire city at any time, and that we've just avoided that fate purely by luck. Sleep tight, kids. Story 60. I think we need more widespread recognition of how Vasily Arkhipov basically saved the world from disaster. Serving aboard a Russian sub in 1962, they were found off the coast of Cuba by the U.S. Navy. Unable to radio the Russian sub, which was too deep to radio, they dropped signal depth charges, which caused weak explosions designed not to cause damage, but to statistically let the sub know, hey, we see you, come up. The captain of the Russian sub thought they were under attack and that war had broken out. He then decided, let's launch our nuclear torpedo, take them all with us. Usually the captain of the sub would only need authorization from their political officer, but in this case it required all 3 senior officers' approval. While he was technically second in command under the captain, Vasily was actually the commodore of the flotilla. He was the only one to keep a cool head and decline, stated they should surface and await instructions. That nuclear launch could have killed tons of people, and then even more through retaliatory launches by both sides. The world would look very different today if not for one man's level-headedness. I believe he was posthumously given the Future of Life Award. Story 61. The treatment of Mexican immigrants during and around World War II. Obviously, it's not good now either, but back then, America and Mexico had several systems in place for immigrants to cross the border in order to fill U.S. farmers' needs for cheap labor, especially during wartime. However, every few years, a wave of anti-immigration sentiment would wash over America, and working-class Mexicans were forced back over the border. Farmers were forced to constantly lobby for cheap Mexican labor because they knew no American would deal with the living/working conditions. Immigrants were paid so little, even back then, that they reported eating cardboard just to fill their stomachs. There was a small turning point where, in a desperate ploy for labor, farmers tried to hire Americans who weren't drafted into the war. But that quickly fell apart when the U.S. workers complained about literally everything to do with working as an unskilled labor. Crazy to see just how willing the U.S. is to blame immigrants for taking jobs that historically they've never even wanted because when they got them, and here's the big reveal, they effing hated them. Story 62. Not a historian, but the secret atomic bomb testing which Great Britain conducted. Sometime after World War II, British soldiers were used as test subjects to witness atomic bomb development in, I think, the Pacific Ocean. Soldiers sat on the deck of an aircraft carrier and were told to close their eyes and tuck their face in their elbow. They were a safe distance from the explosion itself, but survivors say it was so bright that they could see the bones in their hands and arms. The soldiers were exposed to so much radiation that about half the group died within so many years. The government wrote it off as natural causes. The remaining survivors had their own health complications, such as infertility and cancers. I tried looking for a video or article to link, but couldn't find the exact one I heard this from. Story 63. This one might not be a surprise to some, but as a Southerner who learned this while in college up north, it's pretty interesting. The Confederacy had absolutely no chance of winning the Civil War. I guess what shocked me the most was the drastic difference in resources. Even more shocking, the sheer ignorance of the South thinking that they even had a chance. On top of that, it's insane the amount of slaves that were forced to fight for the Confederacy and then live in essentially even worse conditions as sharecroppers after emancipation. I think the compromise to elect Rutherford B. Hayes and effectively end Reconstruction is also really not discussed enough in American history. If Reconstruction were taken seriously and politicians weren't total corrupt pieces of crap, we might be years ahead as a society in terms of racial equity, education, reparations, and economic growth in the South in general. Story 64. February 28th to 28 incident, Taiwan, 1947. After Japan surrendered at the end of World War II, Taiwan was no longer under Japanese rule and was handed to the ROC, Republic of China, which was led by the Kuomintang. Locals didn't like the corrupt and heavy-handed authoritative new rule, and it all came to a head when an officer bullied, then struck a Taiwanese widow selling contraband cigarettes. An officer fired at the crowd of angry bystanders and a man died. The day after, demonstrators were fired upon again. The Taiwanese people revolted, and the uprising was violently put down. The resulting massacre resulted in the deaths of between 5,000 to 28,000 people. For the next 38 years, until 1987, the island was put under martial law in an event called the White Terror, which in tens of thousands of Taiwanese went missing, died or were imprisoned. 100,000 imprisoned, 1,000 executed. The 228 incident was a taboo subject and was not allowed to be talked about until the 1990s when a formal apology was made from the government, and the date was declared in memorial of the victims, mostly wiki-referenced. Being Taiwanese American myself, I didn't even know about this until in recent years. All I knew about it was that my mom and dad seemed to have a rough time growing up in Taiwan post-World War II. Food scarcity, curfews, being afraid of police, etc. Story 65. The Halifax explosion of 1917 is still the largest non-nuclear man-caused explosion in history. Like every incident, there were multiple points of organizational and human error, leading to the Norwegian SSIMO on a collision course with the French Mont Blanc, carrying explosives to France for the war. Remember the Bayreau explosion last year? This would have been about 3 to 5 times more powerful. The collision caused cargo on the Mont Blanc to topple, and sparks from the crash started a fire. 20 minutes later, everything within half a mile was leveled by the explosion. Part of the ship's anchor was found 3 kilometers away. The explosion killed 1,600 almost instantly from the pressure wave, collapsed buildings, and tsunami, with a few hundred more dying from fires and other injuries across the city of Halifax. One interesting figure is Patrick Coleman, a railway worker, saved the lives of a few hundred passengers by telegraphing incoming trains about the imminent explosion, giving his life in the process. Some of the saddest casualties were the Mi'kmaq people living in a settlement further down the bay. The community was largely wiped out by the ensuing tsunami, and the survivors never resettled. That area is a power plant now. Story 66. It's so crazy to think of how many abhorrently effed up, brutal, terrifying, and despicable things us humans have done to each other. Reading through this thread and seeing things like genocides, entire cultures being wiped out and their entire history destroyed, whole communities of people kicked out of their homes and starving to death, newborn children being killed and used as experiments, natural disasters killing thousands, terrorist attacks, and so much more. Go tell your family you love them and reflect for a moment on how lucky we all are to be alive and relatively comfortable, not having to worry about radioactive or carcinogenic materials in our beauty products, or having to fear for our lives every day under a brutal regime. Story 67. The Italian Hall Disaster. In Calumet, Michigan, 1913, a Christmas party was being held in the upper room of the Italian Hall. It was a welcome reprieve because the community was locked in a stalemate, striking against the unsafe work in the copper mines. The year had been tense, and even in a good year, winter in the Keweenaw Peninsula was always tough. Everyone needed something to celebrate, especially the children. All of a sudden, someone, no one is sure who, yelled, "Fire!" Many people believe that one of the Union busters yelled it into the window. Some say that they saw the man, and he had a Citizens Alliance, anti-union, pin on his jacket. It didn't take long for people to panic. After all, there were children in the building, and the people brought in to break the strike weren't above hurting children. They had shown that much. There was one narrow fire escape that could only be accessed by climbing out the window, but nobody was thinking about that. All they were focused on was the narrow staircase that led down to the street, to safety. But the door opened inward. Everyone was too frantic to think clearly. They had to get out the door. People piled on top of people. In all, 73 people died. 59 of them were children. And there wasn't a fire. There was never any fire. Story 68. The Nazino tragedy just before World War II, a plan was given to Stalin about removing all of the unwanted people from the populated areas of Russia and send them to Siberia to become productive. If you didn't get a special passport or they just didn't like you, off you went. It was mostly criminals and the homeless. They packed everyone on trains with almost no food. What little food went out was stolen by the gangs that banded together. Many starved on the trip. 10 to 1 men to women, and SA was a constant event. 5,000 of them were eventually dumped onto Zeno Island with some bags of flour. Immediately, riots start, fighting over the food, and the guards ended up just firing into the crowd. They later found evidence that showed the guards were hunting people like animals. And then it got worse. Total anarchy. The gangs took over, and anyone was prey. Killing for fun, killing for teeth, killing for cannibalism. In a period of 13 weeks, of the roughly 6,000 deportee settlers intended for Zeno Island, between 1,500 to 2,000 had died due to starvation, exposure, disease, murder, or accidental death. Another 2,000 settlers had disappeared, and their whereabouts were untraceable, so they were presumed dead. The death tolls include people who either died or disappeared during their transportation to or from the island. On the island, there was a guard named Kostya Yenikov, a young fellow. He fell in love with a girl who had been sent there and was courting her. He protected her. One day, he had to be away for a while, and he told one of his comrades, "Take care of her." But with all the people there, the comrade couldn't do much, really. People caught the girl, tied her to a poplar tree, cut off her breasts, her muscles, everything they could eat. Everything. They were hungry. They had to eat. When Kostya came back, she was still alive. He tried to save her, but she had lost too much blood. Story 69. Native American Slave Trade. The African slave trade is much more widely known because there are many more living descendants of the victims than that of the Native American one, but European colonists got their slave labor from any source they could. In North America, many Native American nations had a tradition of raiding rival groups for captives. Usually, they were symbolically adopted into the tribe and became part of the new tribe. When Europeans came into North America, they began to trade with Native American nations for a variety of goods, one of them being slaves. This changed the dynamic by encouraging native peoples with trading relations with Europeans to go on more raids on their neighbors. The fact that guns were one of the trade goods Europeans traded to Native Americans only exacerbated the problem, as it gave the groups with already existing ties with Europeans even more of an advantage in their raids and wars with their neighbors, and also encouraged other native groups to look to trading with Europeans so they could get guns of their own in an arms race. Story 70. Quite frankly, I'm not sure how well known this is outside the region, but I've never seen a foreigner talk about it, so thought I'd mention it. The Serbian genocide during World War II. Information on the event varies greatly from source to source, as documentation from the time is very scarce. The Serbian people had enough on their plate and didn't bother documenting everything in detail. The independent state of Croatia, run by Ante Pavlovich at the time, worked closely with the Nazis. The Ustaše regime brutally murdered tens of thousands of Roma and Jewish people in the region by the instructions from German officials. However, it is less known that they killed possibly up to 1 million Serbs from Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, and Montenegro. Most estimates for the Jasenovac concentration camp alone are between 400,000 and 700,000. However, massacres outside of the camp should also be taken into account. They had one of the biggest concentration camp complexes in Europe, Jasenovac, as well as the only concentration camp dedicated solely to children, Gradska. Survivors of the camp tell horrific stories about the treatment of the prisoners. Some common methods being, for example, cutting open a pregnant woman's abdomen, ripping the fetus out, and sewing a live animal such as a cat or a rat back inside, burning and boiling prisoners alive, and using their bodily fluids to make soap for other prisoners to use, cutting out eyes, tongues, cutting off ears and limbs, all while the prisoner is still alive, gutting them alive, etc. They even had a special knife called a Serb cutter. But they didn't just stop at killing the campers. Oh no. They massacred plenty of villages. I recommend looking into the Prevlovici massacre if you can stomach it. Basically, the men of Prevlovici knew the Utashi were coming and left to hide in the woods, thinking the Utashi wouldn't murder their women and children. Let's just say they were very wrong, and by the time they came back to the village, all they found were the bodies of their loved ones completely mutilated. Another common practice of the Utashi was essaying underage girls while forcing their mothers to hold them up while they got essayed, or even forcing family members to essay each other at gunpoint. Another thing I'd like to mention is that a lot of people involved in all this got away with it completely. For example, Nada Sakic was in charge of the Grazia camp and was well known among the prisoners as a devil. She frequently killed women and children for no reason and gladly tortured them at any opportunity she had. Once the war was over, she and many other Utashi ran away to Argentina. In 1998, The Yugoslav government requested Nada Sakic to be brought to Yugoslavia so she could be tried for her crimes. However, the Croatian government stepped in and asked for her themselves. Everyone assumed Croatia would try her for the crimes as well, but they essentially got rid of all evidence against her and gave her a home in an elite home for pensioners in Zagreb. Later in 2011, the government of Serbia and Interpol once again asked for Nada Sakic, at which point the Croatian government had revealed that she died peacefully earlier that year. She never faced any punishment and lived and died in peace. Another horrific thing is that this is all allowed to be forgotten. I saw a video where they asked Croatians about the victims of the camp, and most of them said something akin to about 20,000 people were killed in the camp, mostly communist Croatians, but also Jews and Roma people. One man, who claims to be a historian, even said that no one was killed in the camp, and that it was an education camp where the prisoners simply watch plays that were put on for them. The Jasenovic Museum in Croatia has no images of victims, or even weapons used against them, only a few letters written for their families, mainly Croatian ones. Also, a tomb church was built for the Orthodox Christian Serb victims of the Preblici massacre, was blown up by Croatians sometime in the 90s and was turned into a garbage dump, all on top of their mutilated bodies. Apologies for the long post and odd formatting. I'm on mobile. I also hope I use the correct terminology, as English isn't my first language. Story 71. California's genocide. It's estimated up to 150,000 natives or more died. The state paid bounties in excess of $1.7 million at $5 per scalp, ears, or head in the mid-1800s. After a forced march of 250 to 450 miles, the federal government put Navajos, men, women, children, and elderly, into an internment camp they called the Bosque Redondo Reservation. Many women were forced into prostitution to serve the army stationed there to prevent them leaving. There was inadequate food, water, shelter, and medical care. The camp land was not adequate for farming or sheep, though that was what they were told to do. They were also forced to become Christian. 1 out of 4 died during their years at the camp before they negotiated a treaty that allowed them to go home. Story 72. During World War II, the British attack on French ships in Mers El Kapir. France was surrendering to Nazi Germany. The British needed to prevent Germany from using the French Navy at all costs. The French refused several options to guarantee the ships would stay out of the war. Winston Churchill decided the risk was too great and ordered the British Navy to fire on the French Navy, resulting in the deaths of 1,297 French sailors. Exercise Tiger, a rehearsal for the D-Day invasion, went horribly wrong due to miscommunication, resulting in the deaths of 700 plus. The numbers are disputed. U.S. and Allied troops. Troops landed on an English coast, as they would on D-Day. To better simulate the exact conditions, the Navy fired rounds just as they would on D-Day. They were supposed to fire several miles down the beach. Due to poor radio signal, some of the ships fired on the troops. Story 73. The Labor Day hurricane of 1935 in Key West. In late August 1935, a patch of windy thunderstorms rolled off the coast of Africa and rumbled across the Atlantic Ocean. These storms, known as tropical waves, are the seeds from which hurricanes can form. Most tropical waves don't develop into hurricanes, but sometimes conditions are exactly right. The storms pick up a counterclockwise circulation imparted by Earth's rotation, draw energy from warm, late summer seawater, and evolve into a tropical storm. Meteorologists didn't have a lot to work with to help them track these storms in 1935. Radar was in its infancy, and weather satellites were the stuff of science fiction. Still, the U.S. Weather Bureau, predecessor of the Weather Service, had launched a national advertising campaign in July 1935 to assure the nation that Atlantic hurricanes would no longer avoid detection. Around 2 p.m. on Monday, Labor Day, Fred Gent called to order the evacuation train. It was then that he discovered that it would take workers hours to assemble the train in Miami. Around 8:15 p.m., the rescue train rolled into Isla Morta and stopped to pick up Ray Sheldon and other administrators. Sheldon climbed aboard the locomotive. Moments later, the full fury of the storm's winds, likely 200 mph, and massive storm surge slammed into the island. A newspaper reporter aboard the train later recalled that the passenger cars were, quote, swirled about like straws. Only the 160-ton locomotive remained upright on the tracks. 408 people died, which was half the people that lived between Miami and Key West. It was said that the storm blew every tree off the island chain, yet the verdict stood. The storm, given no name but the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, began slipping into the mists of history. Story 74, the Bosnian War, 1992 to 1995. Despite being one of NATO's first military and peacekeeping operations, heavy involvement in urban environments, jet plane combat, televised/documented injuries of civilians, high civilian death tolls, even in a United Nations era, and its recentness in modern history, no one ever seems to talk much about it. It is undeniable that this conflict had a significant impact for Croatian, Serbian, Yugoslavian, and Bosnian communities around the world. Yet we hear little on a day-to-day basis about the stories and impact this war had. Story 75, the Lebanese Civil War. It's pretty unknown to anyone who doesn't actively study the Middle East. At the time, Lebanon was considered one of the best countries on earth and was a top tourist destination. When the war started in 1975, it all came crashing down. Upwards of 100,000 were killed and millions left the country. So many left that today, there are more Lebanese living outside of the country than inside. Depending on what religion you were or which neighborhood you were from, you could be kidnapped and or killed on the spot if you were stopped. My dad, who immigrated because of the war, actually used to make the joke that a Christian militia would stop someone they thought was Palestinian and show them a tomato and ask them to say what it was. Since they pronounce it slightly differently than Lebanese, they would be shot for saying it the wrong way. Another story is that he saw a Jeep dragging a body with barbed wire around the neck through the streets, and they stopped at the church across the street from his house, left their guns in the car because you don't bring them into the house of God, attended mass, and went back out killing. Roving checkpoints, snipers, and militias on the streets ensured traveling anywhere was unsafe. They actually used to announce on the radio which roads were safe to take and which weren't, and started showing TV programs during the day instead of evenings so people wouldn't go out to fight. Since then, the country hasn't had 24/7 electricity and water in many parts. With a corrupt government and hyperinflated currency, the situation is very bleak. They export more highly educated per capita than any other country. Just 2 years ago, the Lebanese lira was stable at 1,500 LL to the dollar. Today, it is more than 10,000 LL to the dollar. Story 76. The Bath School Disaster, Bath, Michigan. Andrew Kehoe, the 55-year-old school board treasurer, was angered by increased taxes and his defeat in the April 5, 1926 election for township clerk. Kehoe had a reputation for difficulty on the school board and in personal dealings. In addition, he was notified in June 1926 that his mortgage was going to be foreclosed upon. For much of the next year, until May 1927, Kehoe purchased explosives. He secretly hid them on his property and under the school. On May 18, 1927, Kehoe then set off almost simultaneous explosions at his farmstead and at the Bath Consolidated School. His devices destroyed the farm's buildings and ripped through the north wing of the Bath Consolidated School building. As rescuers began working at the school, Kehoe drove up to the schoolyard and detonated dynamite inside his shrapnel-filled truck. The truck explosion killed Kehoe plus 4 other people and also injured bystanders. During the rescue and recovery efforts, searchers discovered an additional 500 pounds, 230 kilograms, of unexploded dynamite and pyridol in the south wing of the school that had been set to go off at the same time as the initial explosions in the north wing. Kehoe had apparently intended to destroy the entire school and kill everyone in it. Story 77. The Moriori Genocide. While a fairly small event by world standards, it's a tragic microcosm of human cruelty. The Moriori were an offshoot of Maori culture, the indigenous people of New Zealand. They settled in the Chatham Islands, small islands off the main New Zealand islands, from around 1500. Over the centuries, while maintaining trade ties with the Maori, the Moriori developed their own language and a largely pacifist culture. In the early 1800s, in the midst of wars between the Maori and the English invaders, some tribes of Maori equipped themselves with muskets. Around November 1835, Maoris invaded the Chatham Islands, easily overwhelming the pacifist Moriori. The resulting genocide left 95% of the Moriori dead, considered one of the worst genocides in human history. Acknowledgement and reparations for the Moriori have been a long time coming. The Chatham Islands remain largely uninhabited to this day. Note that I'm not in any way trying to pin this on the Maori, who were themselves being similarly attacked by the British at the same time. Story 78. Citing Wikipedia soon. An expedition to find a Northwest Passage has been launched, and everyone on board HMS Terror and HMS Erebus were found recently only after a couple hundred years. Everyone on board is dead. They resorted to terrible means of cannibalism as a last-ditch effort, and it was to no avail. Franklin's lost expedition was a British voyage of Arctic exploration led by Captain Sir John Franklin that departed from England in 1845 aboard two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, and was assigned to traverse the last unnavigated sections of the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic. The expedition met with disaster after both ships and their crews, a total of 129 officers and men, became icebound in Victoria Strait near King William Island, in what is today the Canadian territory of Nunavut. After being icebound for more than a year, Erebus and Terror were abandoned in April 1848, by which point Franklin and nearly 24 others had died. The survivors, now led by Franklin's deputy Francis Crozier and Erebus captain James Fitzjames, set out for the Canadian mainland and disappeared. Disappeared trying to find civilization and immediate help. Died from freezing and starvation. There's a beautiful song about this event, and it introduced me to the horrible event that happened. Stan Rogers, Northwest Passage. Story 79. I want to preface by saying that I'm not a historian. I found out about this recently, and I don't think many people know about this. The Bhopal gas tragedy in India in 1984. It's India's worst gas industrial tragedy, killing 2,500 people, wiping out the town the plant was in, and 500,000 people were exposed. It's also the world's most traumatic chemical accident in history. Union Carbide, the pesticide company, has a chemical plant in India where they made MIC. As far as we're aware, the exact cause of the accident is unknown. The Indian government says it was from poor management and non-existent maintenance. Union Carbide says it was sabotage. The MIC safety systems were malfunctioning, and lines and valves were in poor condition. Also, vent gas scrubbers and the steam boiler, used to clean the pipes, were also out of service. During the late evening hours on December 2, 1984, water entered a side pipe and into a tank that contained 42 tons of MIC that had been there since late October. The water led to an exothermic reaction, which was accelerated by contaminants, high ambient temps, and other factors, like the presence of iron from the corroding steel pipelines. The pressure in the tank went from 2 psi at 10:30 p.m. to 10 psi at 11:30 p.m. Two senior refinery employees assumed the reading was a malfunction of the instrument. By 11:30 p.m., workers in the MIC area were experiencing some symptoms of MIC exposure and started to look for leaks. One was found by 11:45 and reported to the MIC supervisor on duty. The decision from the MIC supervisor was to examine the leak after a tea break at 12:15 a.m. In the meantime, the employees were instructed to look for more leaks. In the 5 minutes after the tea break, which ended at 12:40 a.m., the reaction in the tank reached a critical state at an alarming speed. Tank temps were off the scale, maxed out beyond 25 C, and the pressure in the tank was 40 psi. One employee witnessed a concrete slab above the tank crack as the emergency release valve burst, and the pressure in the tank rose to 55 psi, despite the fact that atmospheric venting of toxic MIC gas had already begun. The atmospheric venting should have been prevented, but the prevention measures in place were rendered inoperable. 30 tons of MIC escaped from the tank into the atmosphere in 45 to 60 minutes. This increased to 40 tons in 2 hours. The gases were blown southeast into Bhopal. The siren was set off by an employee at 12:50 a.m. when the concentration of the gas in and around the plant became too much to tolerate. Activation of the system usually triggered 2 alarms, one on the inside of the plant and one on the outside, alerting the public and the city of Bhopal. However, the 2 sirens had been decoupled in 1982, so that it was possible to leave the factory warning alarm on while turning off the public one. So the public one was sounded at 12:50 and then quickly turned off, since company procedure meant to avoid alarming the public over tiny leaks. Workers evacuated, traveling upwind. Since MIC gas is twice as dense as air in an open environment, the gas will fall to the ground. As people were sleeping, the gas spread throughout Bhopal and the towns nearby. All the while, the UCC plant continued to spill MIC gas. By daybreak, thousands of people had died, with the cause of death being choking, reflexogenic circulatory collapse, and pulmonary edema. Autopsies revealed changes to the lungs, cerebral edema, tubular necrosis in the kidneys, fatty degeneration of the liver, and necrotizing enteritis. The stillbirth rate rose 300%, and the non-natal mortality rate rose about 200%. Lacking any safe alternative on December 16, 1984, the tanks that leaked were emptied of any remaining MIC by reactivating the plant and continuing the manufacture of pesticide. Despite safety precautions, like water-carrying helicopters circling the plant, this led to a second mass evacuation from Bhopal. 200,000 children were exposed to the gases, and the effects of this are still going on through the present day, and will likely see the effects generations down the road. Story 80. Oradour-sur-Glane comes to mind. A small village in the middle of France subjected to German reprisals for local assistance activities on June 10, 1944. The entire village, 642 people, wiped out in a few hours. Men machine-gunned against the walls, women and children locked in the church, and then it was lit on fire. Only one woman survived the attack, gravely injured. After the war, de Gaulle made the ruins a memorial to never forget, so it is possible to walk through the city and see the bullet holes, and burned-out homes with plaques of who lived there and their occupation, and the graveyard with 90% of the graves with the same death date. Story 81. The Kashmir Genocide, or the Exodus in Kashmir. It started since 1989, and almost 600,000 people were affected because of this. Back then, there were a lot of anti-programs by Muslims against everyone else. The most horrifying was the three options. According to it, the other religion people, mostly Hindustan, had only three options. They had to convert to Islam, die, or leave Kashmir, but if they leave, they have to leave behind their mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives for them to enjoy. This was openly given in the newspapers. You can still find the clippings in news videos in Google where they were openly stating these options. Thousands and thousands of women, including children, were brutally SA'd during that period. They wouldn't even kill them. They'd tie them up in front of their husbands or fathers or brothers or sons and SA them. Later, the men would be tortured physically as a mode of entertainment for years at a stretch. One of the reasons the terrorist Muslims from you-know-where are always unhappy with India is because we won't let them do all this anymore. India has lost a lot to the Mughals after their invasion. It just can't be possible to describe their atrocities in words. Historians of India say that the Britishers were a bit better than the Muslim or Mughal invasion in India. Story 82. Old Post of Mine Hyatt Regency Disaster. On July 17, 1981, a disaster in Kansas City, Missouri would change the world of engineering forever. The event came to be known as the worst engineering disaster, only to be topped by 9/11. At the time of the disaster, the Hyatt Regency Hotel was one of the most popular venues. The dance hall was known as the location for a fun night out. Not only was the Hyatt Regency a hotel, but it contained retail space and entertainment venues. On the night of the disaster, a tea dance was in full swing. For reference, a tea dance is a social event that occurs between 4 to 7 p.m., in which tea and sandwiches are served. Origins of tea dances can be traced back to the French colonization of Morocco. 4 walkways hung above the atrium. The highest will be called the fourth, and the lowest will be called the first. The fourth and second were directly above each other, with the third and first hanging on the opposite side of the room. Each walkway was around 37 meters long and weighing in at around 29,000 kgs, roughly 63,934.406 pounds. It was common for spectators to stand on these walkways and observe the events below. These platforms would cause one of the worst engineering disasters in history. At 7:05 p.m., spectators were standing on the fourth walkway in the atrium. A series of pops could be heard. Then the fourth walkway collapsed. During its collapse, the walkway took down the second walkway directly below it, along with 40 spectators. The 2 walkways fell down onto the 1,600 people below. The 14 hours of rescue efforts of first responders were halted by numerous challenges. Both dead and alive victims were stuck under thousands of pounds of concrete, glass, and steel. First responders were called dismembering bodies of the dead to reach the injured. Additionally, on-site amputations occurred to save those pinned under rubble. Some received morphine while being trapped, while others were freed by chainsaw amputation. To further complicate rescue efforts, the disaster caused the sprinkler systems to malfunction, resulting in a constant shower of water. Hotel workers were unable to shut off the water systems as they were sourced from water tanks, not the city. The fire chief had the atrium doors bulldozed as they were preventing water from draining from the room. While no victims died due to drowning, they were in constant threat of it, with many nearly dying from it. There was very little visibility in the room. Power was cut to prevent fires, and the air was full of dust. The dead, whose bodies could be recovered, were taken to an exhibition room that turned into a makeshift morgue. The lawn of the hotel became a triage area in an attempt to save the injured. The community responded with an outpouring of support. Local construction companies brought concrete saws, jackhammers, lights, cranes, and other resources to save dancers trapped under the rubble. Blood banks in the area had lines outside of the door. In total, 114 people died, 216 were injured, and 29 people were rescued from the rubble. The last person to be rescued was named Mark Williams. Mark spent more than 9 hours pinned underneath the lower skywalk, with both legs dislocated and having nearly drowned before the water was shut off. Why it occurred? The cause of the disaster was an unapproved change in the fourth and second walkway suspension. The walkways were originally planned to be hung by one continuous rod. However, after a phone conversation with Haven Steel, the plan was changed to hang the walkways by 2 connecting rods. This change occurred without the submission of formal plans to change the design. The construction company, Jack D. Gillum and Associates, was concerned that the continuous rods would be damaged during construction. The change to 2 rods altered the amount of force on the fourth walkway, with the investigation concluding that the top walkway could only sustain 30% of the weight added to it. However, according to engineering.com, had this change in hanger rod detail not been made, the ultimate capacity of the box beam hanger rod connection still would have been far short of that expected of a connection designed in accordance with the Kansas City Building Code. The investigation further revealed that before the incident, the atrium would have only passed 60% of the city's building codes. 300 civil lawsuits were filed for a total of $3 billion. At the end of 26 weeks of court proceedings, victims were paid a total of $140 million before insurance. Jack D. Gillum and Associates were charged, but acquitted, of criminal negligence and manslaughter. However, the company lost their license to practice in Missouri, Kansas, and Texas, as well as its membership with the American Society of Civil Engineers, ASCE. Estimates state that nearly every person in the tight-knit community knew someone impacted by this event. Due to the tragic events, the ASCE adopted a report that states structural engineers have full responsibility for design projects. Further, Kansas City's Codes Administration became its own department, doubling its staff and dedicating a single engineer comprehensively to all aspects of each reviewed building. 2 Kansas City newspapers, the Kansas City Star and the Kansas City Times, won Pulitzer Prizes for their investigations into the collapse. Jack D. Gillum passed away in 2012, but dedicated his entire life to educating engineering students on how to avoid similar disasters. He claimed that the disaster haunted him every day. First responders were so traumatized by the event that they had to form a support group. Country Bill Allman, the man who brought the jackhammer to the hotel, self-unalived years later. Since the event, the Hyatt Regency collapse has become a focus of engineering education. NASA even has a case study about it. The hotel has since been renovated and claims to be the, quote, possibly safest hotel in the nation. A memorial was erected in Hospital Hill Park, funded by Skywalk Memorial Foundation, a resource for those impacted by the tragic event. Story 83. The Iroquois, or Haudenosaunee, absolutely ravaged and really controlled the northwestern region of modern New York and even annihilated other groups near the Great Lake. Most specifically, the nation known as the Neutrals. The British and Dutch both gave the Haudenosaunee such a power dynamic in the region during the time with weapons and basically a monopoly on beaver pelts that some groups willingly surrendered prior to their advances. They were referred to as the Romans of the New World by the Jesuits, who either lived among or near them. Honestly, Iroquoian history is such a fascinating one, yet it is not taught past the Three Sisters and their role in the Revolution. Their form of governance, which still exists today, philosophy, origin, and overall rich and amazing culture, is so overlooked in every facet of study that takes part in upstate and western New York. I've learned so much, and I'm so grateful to this podcast. I've also taken a large portion of my free time to study in college, currently in undergrad, in their role in environmental stewardship prior to and during European colonization. Sadly, they are still largely forgotten about as a whole. Story 84. U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt prevented Anne Frank's family from entering U.S. soil, and thus banished most of them to death. You know who Anne Frank is, a young Jewish girl living in Amsterdam during World War II. She was forced to hide with her family and another family in the attic of a building where her father worked for 2 years while Nazis searched for Jews. She wrote a detailed diary during her time in confinement, and that's why we know about her. She was also put on the last train from her neighborhood to the Auschwitz concentration camp and was later moved to Bergen-Belsen, where she died at the age of 15. FDR had publicly stated that immigrant Jews and Germans could be spies, and also placed U.S. citizens of Japanese descent into internment camps, coerced by Nazi-dominated nations. But Anne's father, Otto, was a well-connected man. He had relationships with members of the Roosevelt White House, including FDR's wife, Eleanor. Despite Otto Frank's skill at navigating paperwork and charming the right people, the president's anti-immigrant policy grew stricter. Despite having ties to the Roosevelt family, Otto Frank was unable to convince American acquaintances that more Jewish refugees should be allowed into the country. He was the only member of the Frank family who survived the Holocaust and took part in editing his daughter's diary, which originally included sexual thoughts about other girls and descriptions of menstruation before it was published. It's been pointed out by numerous contemporary historians that Donald Trump's foreign policies, including referring to South Americans as essayers and attributing COVID-19 to Chinese people by calling it the, quote, China virus or Kung flu, that he replicated Roosevelt's attempts to publicly demonize harmless groups that sometimes need America's help desperately. Trump would have let Anne Frank be gassed and cremated because she was a Jew. Story 85. Weinkauf Hotel Fire in 1946. Deadliest hotel fire in U.S. history, and killed 119 hotel occupants, including the hotel's original owners. The Weinkauf Hotel was built by William F. Weinkauf and completed in 1913. The structure was of brick, ordinary joist construction. The floors were numbered 1 to 16, excluding the numbering of a 13th floor, and it is said that the number 13 was never posted any place within the building. In its center core were 2 enclosed elevators and an open T-shaped stairway. Built utilizing the 1911 building codes and classified as fireproof at that time, the steel frame was protected, and the roof and floors were concrete with protected steel beams and girders. Although there was considerable attention given to making the building's structural members fire-resistive, there was no automatic sprinkler system, no fire doors, and no exterior fire escapes. However, the building did meet the existing codes and was widely advertised as a fireproof hotel. It is believed that some 280 guests occupied the Weinkauf Hotel on Friday evening, December 6th, including a large number of teenagers from across the state of Georgia, in town to attend the annual youth assembly at the Georgia State Capitol, which was being sponsored by the YMCA. Upon the fire department's arrival at the Weinkauf, having arrived there within 2 minutes of receiving the alarm, the firefighters discovered dense smoke and flames emitting from the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors. To compound this sight, the horrifying sound of voices and trapped occupants could be heard echoing from the thick smoke. The fire chief ordered the ladders run up, but they were unable to reach the upper floors. The firefighters also attacked the blaze from the inside, but were unable to make much headway. Much to the horror of the firefighters, bodies began to appear through the thick smoke from above and violently plummeted to the sidewalk. As the aerial ladders were being raised to rescue the trapped occupants, floodlights were activated and directed upon the building, which revealed the panic-stricken faces of the people who were desperately pleading and waving for help while hanging from the windows of their rooms. On the backside of the building, thick smoke filled the 10-foot-wide alley between the Weinkauf Hotel and the 12-story mortgage guarantee building on Ellis Street. Here, the scene was not unlike the one on Peachtree Street, at the front of the building, with the exception that there was no space in which to maneuver an aerial ladder. Here, firefighters could not see the victims hanging from their windows because of the smoke. However, they could hear them desperately calling for help. The fire continued to intensify within the building as the dark, thick smoke began to push from the windows with an ever-increasing velocity. Along with the upsurge in the momentum of the smoke, bursts of orange flames began to appear within the smoke coming from the windows, followed by a flashover, which occurred with a mighty blast. Multiple floors burst into flames all at once, and the orange glow illuminated the surrounding buildings with an ominous amber glow. In all, 119 people had been killed, and over 100 others injured. Among this number was 30 teenagers in town for the youth assembly, and William and Grace Weinkauf, who died in their 16th floor penthouse. 32 engines, 5 aerial ladders, 6 city service ladder trucks, and other support vehicles totaling 49 pieces of fire service apparatus responded to the Weinkauf Hotel fire. The cause of this tragic event remains a mystery even today. Story 86. In 1990, a girl gave false testimony in front of the U.S. House of Representatives. The girl, named Naira, alleged a lot of human rights abuses and barbarous behavior, such as babies being thrown out of incubators. This false testimony led to the United States entering the First Gulf War, which did untold damage to the area. It also turned out that the girl was the daughter of Kuwait's ambassador, not some random Kuwaiti girl. The company that orchestrated the whole thing was the PR firm Hill & Knowlton, the same one that is handling the COVID-19 communication strategy. Story 87. The story of Ferdinand Magellan and Lapu-Lapu. We were all taught that Ferdinand Magellan was the first European explorer to travel around the world. Well, sort of. His crew and ship made it, but Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines. Now, that's as far as they tell us. What has been kept quiet is that he was killed in a battle on April 27, 1521, with a Filipino chief named Lapu-Lapu. Magellan and his men fought a battle with Lapu-Lapu on request from Catholic authorities because Lapu-Lapu refused to convert to Catholicism. This story is kept quiet because it's a black eye on the Catholic Church and Europeans in general. Story 88. The Tenerife Airport Disaster. A KLM Boeing 747 carrying 248 people was landing at the Tenerife Airport in the Canary Islands on March 27, 1977. At the same time, a Pan Am 747 was carrying 396 departing for JFK. There was a fog over the island when the accident occurred, and there was no ground radar system. The Pan Am had to taxi on the runway after a terrorist attack at the Gran Canaria airport had diverted flights to Tenerife. The KLM was starting to land on the same runway as the Pan Am was on. The air traffic control tower couldn't see the planes due to the heavy fog. The Pan Am 747 saw the landing lights of the KLM and tried to speed up in order to get out of the way. The KLM had tried to pull up, but couldn't avoid hitting the plane. All passengers on the KLM plane were killed on impact or from the resulting fire. The Pan Am was hit, with 335 being killed in the collision and the fire afterwards. 61 people in the front of the Pan Am survived with injuries. 583 people were killed in the accident, making it the most deadly airplane accident ever. Story 89. Surprised no one has said this yet, but anyways, the Army Public School massacre that happened in Pakistan in 2014. I still remember coming back from school, seeing my family members crying while watching the news. Even though I was only around 11, I still remember that day vividly. On December 16, 2014, 6 gunmen affiliated with the TTP conducted a terrorist attack on the Army Public School in the northwestern Pakistani city of Peshawar. The militants, all of whom were foreign nationals, comprising 1 Chechen, 3 Arabs, and 2 Afghans, entered the school and opened fire on school staff and children, killing 149 people, including 132 school children ranging from between 8 and 18 years of age, making it the world's 4th deadliest school massacre. A rescue operation was launched by the Pakistan Army Special Services Group, SSG, Special Forces, who killed all 6 terrorists and rescued 960 people. Students were forced to watch their teachers and principal get killed in front of them. I still remember a survivor telling me how he faked his death by laying on the dead bodies covered in blood for hours. The terrorists kept shooting the dead to make sure they died. There are documentaries about the survivors, and to be honest, it's worth watching. Story 90. Indian schools in the U.S. Basically, the motto was, kill the Indian, save the man. This practice, which lasted clear into at least the 1950s, essentially stripped generations of parenting practices passed down from generations. Even young kids, maybe babies, not entirely sure, were taken away to far-off boarding schools so parents lost how to parent. Kids weren't parented with love or even parented. They were basically forced labor camps. Carlisle was a famous one. Almost killed many of the indigenous languages. So, still, there are repercussions from this practice, mostly parents not yet knowing how to properly care for their kids, and grandparents who don't know how to help. Cycles of abuse are that way for a reason. you do to others as was done to you. It was a systematic attack of their culture. That's why when people talk about reparations for slavery, I always stick in how terribly treated First Nations people were/are, because we quickly forget. It's sickening. Not saying slavery wasn't terrible, but a lot of natives were also forced into labor, and a lot more recently than many would like to admit. Story 91. Late to the party, but the October 8, 1871 fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. It is still the deadliest wildfire in history, not just the U.S., but the world since we began keeping track. Death toll is estimated between 1,500 to 2,000, maybe more. The country in that area was seeing a large influx of immigration because of the deal. I forget the acreage at the moment, but it was basically, if cleared this land within so many years, the land was yours, free and clear. Except this was virgin forest, huge trees and dense forests, so it still isn't fully known how many people were in the area that weren't recorded somewhere. 1.2 million acres burned, or 1,875 square miles. In other words, it was bigger than the state of Rhode Island. It's also thought it was hit by a tornado at the same time. Not one created by the fire, but a normal tornado. So why is this not well known? It happened at the same time as the Great Chicago Fire, of the Mrs. O'Leary's cow fame, which was impacted by the same weather system as Peshtigo. I did a Tumblr post years ago with more info linked below. Here's the Peshtigo Fire. P.S. As a former wildland firefighter, I can say this had the scariest fire behavior that I've ever heard of. Some recent fires are getting there, but still not even close. I used to teach my rookies about it and told them that the only response was to run like hell, because nothing we did would make a difference. Story 92. If you're not Ukrainian, Holodomor is pretty high up there. And on the subject of genocide, history teachers never really get the chance to discuss genocide in the Americas that wasn't perpetrated by Europeans. That usually gets covered in the first units about American colonization. However, the Columbian Exchange had other knock-on effects wherever it happened. The Sioux, Comanche, and Apache wiped out dozens of smaller ethnic groups once guns and horses became common in the 18th and 19th century. Human sacrifice is usually sensationalized in regards to the Mayans and Aztecs, but plain old genocide was plenty common in America outside of European colonial efforts. The influx of firearms was a huge destabilizing factor among the Maori and Polynesia, as groups that would have symmetrical conflicts with indecisive results now ended up massacring their traditional families. To kind of flip this question on its head, there is a certain very prominent nation that has literally millions of volunteers and voluntold that crawl through the internet, making sure that their history in regards to Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan is never broadcast. Israel deliberately bombing the USS Liberty isn't discussed near enough. They're bombing an American listening ship that was capable of intercepting communication from Israel about the invasion of the Golan Heights. OPSEC was so important to the Israelis that they killed 9 crewmen in trying to sink it in several attacks. There was no real plausible deniability that the ship was anything else, as Israel shot it with conventional artillery, torpedoes, and missiles in several separate attacks. They attacked it again, and again, and again, knowing full well what ship it was, as they could see the damn name on the side in most cases. If the American public knew about it, then they might not be sympathetic to Israel, and they certainly can't have that. Story 93. The expulsion of the Acadians, also known as the Great Upheaval, the Great Expulsion, and the Great Deportation, was the forced removal by the British of the Acadian people from the present-day Canadian maritime provinces of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and northern Maine, parts of an area historically known as Acadia, causing the death of thousands of people. The expulsion, 1755 to 1764, occurred during the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the 7 Years' War, and was part of the British military campaign against New France. The British first deported Acadians to the 13 colonies and, after 1758, transported additional Acadians to Britain and France. In all, the 14,100 Acadians in the region, approximately 11,500 Acadians were deported. A census of 1764 indicates that 2,600 Acadians remained in the colony, having eluded capture. Story 94. Genocide of California natives during and after the gold rush. Everything about the extermination was methodical and fits to a T the definition of genocide. The The children were taken away. The families and women were killed unceremoniously and left to the animals. All the reports from the U.S. Army are highly inaccurate, and we can never really know how many people died. The men who claimed California and raised the bear flag were racist who shot at the feet of natives to, quote, see them dance. It just got worse when the gold rush started. The men who came from Oregon were even more racist because of fear-mongering along the Oregon Trail and killed indiscriminately any native that crossed their paths. When natives who did own land tried to defend it from miners trying to take their gold, the natives were beaten and shot. If you want to learn more, there's a phenomenal book about it called An American Genocide by Benjamin Madley. He lays out everything that happened since Spanish conquest up to about 1900. Really, really awful, but history is full of genocides with very similar tactics, especially during colonial expansion periods. Story 95. The Dzungar Genocide in the 18th century by the Qing Dynasty. There isn't a lot of available info on this. The population of Dzungars was about 600K before the Qing conquest. The Dzungars waged war with neighboring countries/territories, including China, for decades before being weakened by disease in many battles over the years. At this point, the Qing emperor allegedly ordered his commanders to exterminate them, i.e., kill the young, healthy men. The elderly, women, and children were spared, but could not keep their former names. It is considered one of the largest genocides in the 18th century, and the Dzungars never recovered. They were considered one of the largest groups in Central Asia. In general, Central Asian history isn't very well known or documented outside of Genghis Khan, but as an ethnic Kazakh, a tad biased, I think it's really interesting. Story 96. I never see this talked about, unless others like British history, but The Princes in the Tower. It's such a sad story, and breaks my heart. King Edward V and his brother, Richard Duke of Shrewsbury, they were about 12 and 9 to 10 respectively. No one knows what exactly happened to them or who killed them. It's one of the biggest conspiracies in the world. I'm one of the many people that 100% believe their uncle, who went on to become Richard III, had them killed so he could take the throne. He kept them locked in the Tower of London in 1483, after their father, Edward IV, died. They lived in what is now called the Bloody Tower. Apparently, they had free reign of the grounds and played together and were well taken care of, up until the night they were murdered. Many believe they were smothered/suffocated. Their bodies were shoved in a small chest and buried under the main staircase when you enter the tower. When they were found, they had multiple broken bones, and no one is sure if they were caused when/if they put up a fight against their attackers, or if the bones were broken when they were being shoved in the chest. When they were exhumed, they said the bones belonged to a small child and a preteen boy. The royal family has still not given permission for DNA tests to be taken from their bones to confirm or deny that they are those of the boys. They are buried in Westminster Abbey, in one of the small rooms of the Lady Chapel. They are in a black chest on a ledge in the wall, facing the tomb of their relatives/nieces, Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Mary I, better known as Bloody Mary. Everyone who knows this story is about 99% positive the bones belong to the boys, but it would be nice to have DNA evidence, so maybe they could get a different kind of burial? It breaks my heart because their father just died. The eldest brother, Edward V, was supposed to be king, but was never crowned and thrown into the Tower of London. His younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, was in an asylum at Westminster Abbey, ironically with his mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and other siblings. It is said, and was written by Thomas More, that when Richard III's guards came to the abbey, they threatened Elizabeth Woodville to give them Richard, or they would kill all her children. She reluctantly gave them Richard, and Thomas More said you could hear screams and cries as she watched her little boy being taken. It's just so heartbreaking that she couldn't protect her sons, and the boys didn't have anyone else to protect them or give them some sort of comfort in their last months. Story 97. Well, since you asked, my area of study in history is music history, particularly European medieval music. And you can't study that without hearing about the troubadours. And if you actually take the next step and ask who they were and what happened, that there stopped being troubadours, you find out about the Albigensian Crusade. Basically, what we call today France has two countries, and the northern declared war on the southern at the behest of the Pope in 1209 AD. for the ostensible purpose of routing out heresy and secondary purpose of making the northern aristocrats tremendously wealthy. The heresy was not a myth, though. Catharism was a new anti-papist take on Christianity. Whole cities by that point had gone Cathar, so the Catholic Church made examples of whole cities. You've heard the saying, and possibly laughed at it, "Kill them all, God will know his own." That was an actual historical event. It was allegedly said by the papal legate, Abbot Arnaud Almaric, when asked at the siege of the Béziers, once the Catholic attackers were through the gates, how they should tell the heretics from the good Catholics. So they did. They slaughtered the population of Béziers, regardless of religious faith. They broke down the doors to the Catholic churches of St. Mary Magdalene and of St. Jude, and killed those found sheltering there. This was but one of the first cities in the south of France the Crusaders slaughtered en masse, in a genocidal war that went on for another 20 years. By the time it was done, France was a single country. Story 98. Not a historian, but what I never learned much about in school was the Great Leap Forward. I think most people know of it when the CCP and Mao Zedong began taking tyrannical approaches to governing the people in agriculture. Over 30 million people died from the famine, which makes it the world's worst famine. Mao ordered a war against pests. People began killing hundreds of thousands of sparrows until there were very few or none left, which caused a mass influx of crop-damaging insects, which was a contributor to the famine. Mao also killed or silenced many intellectuals, which led to a mass decline in education. We often hear a lot about Hitler or Stalin occasionally, but we rarely hear about Mao Zedong. Mao is the world's greatest mass murderer, and he is still being praised and commemorated in China to this day. The censorship and propaganda in China still keeps the Chinese people in the dark. This is history being systematically erased by only a few of the most powerful individuals in the world. Story 99. The Netherlands forced Indonesia, the country they colonized for 360 years, to pay for their 4.5 billion guilders sovereignty debts. Not to mention that they asked for 6.5 billion guilders at first, and that the money value were higher back then. The debt finally paid off around 50 years after their independence, at SBY president era. But of course, the damage has been done, and now Indonesia is struggling financially and suffocating in the other debts, while Indonesia's problems, plus 4,500 COVID-19 new cases every day, natural disasters, the capital sinking, etc., are piling up one after another and yet not solved. None of my friends know this, and not a lot of adults know this either. I know this from my father, which I later checked on the internet since I was skeptical. After all, how could our schools have left out such an important part? To my surprise, a Dutch well-known newspaper confirmed this, as with a couple, not much of other Indonesian sources. This part of history isn't taught in Indonesian school, and I'm afraid that eventually no one will remember it. I've never met a Dutch before, but I'm sure no school taught their children how horrible their ancestors were. Story 100. Oh, so many. The dictatorship of Francisco Marcius Nguma, president of Equatorial Guinea from 1968 to 1979. He unleashed a reign of terror to rival those of Pol Pot or Idi Amin, who ruled concurrently with the lesser-known Equatorial-Guinean tyrant. Out of a population of no more than 400,000, some 50,000 to 80,000 were murdered, and up to 150,000 fled. Like in Pol Pot's Cambodia, you could be executed by his regime for wearing glasses. He was overthrown and executed by his nephew, current Equatorial-Guinean president and kleptocratic dictator Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mabaskugo. The forced expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Bloc countries in the aftermath of World War II. Between 1944 and 1950, some 12 to 15 million Germans were driven out of Eastern Europe into West Germany and Austria. Those were the lucky ones. Several 100,000 civilians were sent to internment camps to be used as forced labor. Anywhere from 500,000 to 2.5 million Germans died as a result of this persecution. But because Germany had already done something rather similar in the recent past to the Jews and other so-called undesirables, and the communist atrocities against ethnic Germans were only a fraction of those committed by the Nazis, it was never given the recognition that it deserved. I find that people don't really talk a lot about the 2004 earthquake in the Indian Ocean these days, which is odd when you consider the sheer magnitude of that disaster. Nearly 230,000 people died. Thousands of homes were completely wiped out, and countless lives were permanently uprooted. Beyond that, the damage to the environment was extensive and lingers on to this day. Those are just a few from the top of my head, and all three examples are from the past 100 years. History has no shortage of untold tragedies, both natural and man-made. Story 101. From late March to early April 1918, Armenian and Bolshevik soldiers ruthlessly slaughtered 50,000 Azerbaijanis and Lagizis and looted and destroyed Azeri towns and villages. Mass graves were uncovered, showing the horrors of the extent of the atrocities. Many of the villages the Armenians destroyed still don't exist. Azerbaijan tried to put together a commission to investigate it, but the Soviet invasion stopped any legal repercussions against the perpetrators of the attacks. On February 26, 1992, Armenian soldiers invaded the town of Khojaly in Azerbaijan. They slaughtered over 600 Azeris, including old women and babies. They even cut down civilians trying to flee from the advancing Armenians. Those were just two of the overwhelmingly large amount of crimes against humanity perpetrated by Armenians against Azerbaijan. Story 102. Not a historian, but I briefly studied the Mount Erebus disaster in high school, and it really fits the prompt. In 28 November 1979, an air tourism plane from New Zealand crashed into the side of Mount Erebus, Antarctica, killing all 257 people on board. The crash was the result of human failure, seeing that the information provided to both pilots and cabin crew during briefing was different than that passed on for programming of the board computer the day of the flight, and that, moments before the crash, the crew mistakenly identified landmarks and failed to identify the volcano coming up in front of the craft. The crew had been instructed to follow a path down McMurdo Sound, to the west of Mount Erebus. However, the flight path was altered at 1:40 a.m. on the day of the flight, unbeknownst to anyone from the crew. The new path was in accordance with the previously established air tourism flight paths approved in 1977 that were set to fly above Mount Erebus at a height of 4,000 meters. Thus, seeing that the flight through McMurdo would be made at a height of around 610 to 900 meters, the plane eventually crashed at the site of the volcano, exploding on impact and killing all 257 people on board. That, however, is only part of the story, since the accounts of search and rescue operators are also horrifying and clearly took a psychological toll on those attempting to clear the crash site. The remains of Air Zealand Flight 901 were reached at 9 a.m. on the following day, 20 hours after the crash. The responders immediately reported that there were no survivors. Recovering and identifying passengers was made extremely tough, since body parts had been scattered everywhere, and were sometimes trapped beneath tons of fuselage, not to mention being mostly burnt from the explosion. As such, identification was often made from a finger containing surviving digitals, or a pair of keys in someone's pocket. Still, 40 people were never identified. Responders went through hell in that mountain slope during the 10 days that search and rescue efforts were held. One of the rescuers, Jim Morgan, wrote a very detailed account of their experience, which can be read fully on Wikipedia. But to summarize, they worked 2 shifts, 12 hours on and 12 off, and it was extremely intense physical work. Initially, they had a limited supply of water, and only one bowl to wash their hands in before meals. The water in the bowl would turn black. They did not wash their plates and dishes after eating, and simply passed them on to the next person. Their polar clothes were quickly stained black from ash and human grease, and their wool gloves were also dampened by human grease, released from the burn bodies. Eventually, gulls arrived and started eating at the bodies, and would not back off regardless of what responders did. So they had to pile every single body part, creating around 11 huge piles of bodies, and cover them with snow. When the operation was finally over, bad weather left them stranded on the mountainside, which only worsened everyone's mood, and as helicopters were finally able to come retrieve responders and deceased alike, work increased exponentially as people were evacuated, and those left behind had to work doubled. As a consequence, New Zealand stopped doing air tourism to Antarctica, and it was stopped as a whole around the world, resuming in the 1990s. There were also several laws passed to diminish pollution in the continent, seeing that the freezing temperatures preserve whatever you throw there indefinitely. The initial inquiry blamed the pilots for the crash, but the public pressure caused further investigation, which discovered the negligence behind the Air New Zealand's flight plan and conduct, besides obstruction of justice by not presenting this evidence up front. Hope you enjoyed the read, and sorry for any mistakes. English is not my first language.